In the shadows of America's cities, an invisible boardroom held the fate of the nation's most dangerous criminals. For decades, a secret council ruled the underworld with ruthless precision-brokered peace, sanctioned violence, and controlled billions in illicit power. But how did this mysterious body rise to dominate organized crime? And what dark forces tore it apart from within? Journey into the heart of a criminal empire, where loyalty was sacred, betrayal deadly, and power absolute. This is the untold story of how the Commission ruled America's underworld. Chapter 1: Bloodlines and Black Hand, the Mafia's Roots in America. The story of American organized crime does not begin in smoke-filled back rooms or neon-lit casinos. It begins in the shadows of poverty, fear, and survival carried across the Atlantic, in the hearts of immigrants fleeing the grip of the old world, only to recreate its ghosts in the new. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, waves of Sicilian immigrants arrived in the United States, most of them pouring into the crowded tenement neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and South Philadelphia. They came with little just hopes, hunger, and the habits of the land they left behind. Alongside their customs, faith, and family traditions, they also brought something darker, a deep familiarity with the invisible power structures that ruled Sicily through fear, silence, and blood. Sicily, a land carved by centuries of conquest and corruption, had long been home to secret societies that operated outside the boundaries of law. It was a place where the state was weak, the church was silent, and justice was often settled with the barrel of a gun or the edge of a blade. Out of this void grew the Mafia Cosa Nostra. It was not originally the sprawling empire of organized crime it would later become. It was, at its roots, a code of protection and retribution among men who trusted only family and feared only betrayal. The early Mafia in Sicily was cloaked in Omertà, the code of silence, and bound by loyalty, vengeance, and honor. When these men came to America, they brought more than memories. They brought a system. But here, in the land of opportunity, the system found new fuel. In the crowded urban jungles of early 20th century America, immigrant families faced hostility, poverty, and exclusion. Jobs were scarce, opportunities were fewer, protection was non-existent. And so, within these communities, old-world tactics found new purpose. What had once been a way of surviving foreign occupation in Sicily evolved into a way of surviving the chaos of American streets. The first wave of organized Italian crime in America did not yet call itself the Mafia. It moved in whispers and unsigned letters. It called itself something else: the Black Hand, known in Italian as La Mano Nera. This early form of criminal extortion was both primitive and terrifying. Letters would arrive at the doors of local business owners, written in broken English or thick dialect, often signed with a blackened handprint or a simple skull drawing. The message was always the same: pay or die. Sometimes the threat was made real. A butcher who refused to pay might find his shop riddled with bullets. A grocer might wake to find his daughter kidnapped. Bombings were not uncommon. In New York City alone, by 1908, there were over 100 bombings linked to the Black Hand in a single year. Too many Italian immigrants. The Black Hand was both a curse and a confirmation that even in America, they were not free from the claws of men who traded in fear. And yet, within the terror, there was structure, there was power, and for some, there was opportunity. The Black Hand was not a single organization. It was a method or tool used by individuals or small groups. But over time, it evolved. As the years passed, certain men began to rise above the chaos, organizing the violence, unifying the rackets, and enforcing order in what had been a storm of random crime. One of the earliest figures to emerge from the haze of the Black Hand was Giuseppe Joe Morello. Known as the Clutch Hand for his deformed right hand, Morello had fled Sicily after being accused of counterfeiting and murder. In New York, he quickly established himself as a brutal enforcer and a cunning tactician. Morello's crew in East Harlem and Lower Manhattan became infamous not just for extortion but for counterfeiting, loan sharking, and murder. His men operated like a military unit, disciplined, silent, and deadly. Morello was among the first to understand that fear alone would not build an empire. To endure, crime needed structure, it needed hierarchy, and it needed rules. Morello's reign was marked by violence, but it also set the precedent for what would follow. Across the country, in cities like Chicago, New Orleans, and Cleveland, similar patterns began to emerge. In each, Sicilian immigrants formed criminal organizations built around neighborhood control, extortion, and protection rackets. In New Orleans, the Mafia had taken root even earlier, dating back to the 1890s. When a wave of Sicilian immigrants settled in the French Quarter, that city would be the site of one of the first national headlines about Mafia violence in America: the assassination of Police Chief David Hennessy in 1890, allegedly by a group of Sicilian men, which led to a mob storming the jail and lynching 11 Italian suspects in a single night. This act of vigilante violence sent a message, but not the one intended. Instead of ending the influence of the Mafia in America, it drove it deeper underground. It made secrecy a survival tactic and Omertà a sacred law. In the shadows, the Black Hand methods continued to evolve. Men like Ignazio Lupo the Wolf and Charles Charlie the Wop Capone began to form loose alliances, tightening their grip over neighborhoods block by block. The code was simple: protect your own, punish betrayal, and profit by any means. As Prohibition loomed in the 1920s, these early structures would form the foundation for a criminal renaissance. But in this first chapter of the Commission's legacy, it was bloodlines and blackmail that ruled the streets. There was no commission, yet no formal council, no balance of power. There were only men with old world values and new world ambitions. They operated in silence, but their message was thunderous. In the absence of justice, fear would rule. One of the defining aspects of these early years was the lack of centralized control. Each city had its own bosses, its own methods. Loyalty was local, violence was unpredictable, and without a unified leadership, conflict was inevitable. Turf wars broke out over street corners and protection routes. In New York alone, dozens of small Italian gangs competed for dominance, each seeking to outmuscle the other, often through murder. Kidnappings, disappearances, and vendettas became a regular part of life in Italian-American enclaves. The police, often corrupt or overwhelmed, were powerless to stop a tour, simply unwilling. Despite this chaos, or perhaps because of it, a strange kind of order began to emerge. Men who were smarter, colder, and more calculating began to rise through the ranks. They saw that power didn't come from random violence, but from controlled violence. They understood that profit didn't come from fear alone, but from loyalty, discipline, and cooperation. What began as the Black Hand was slowly mutating into something far more dangerous. A network, a silent machine. At the heart of it all was a shared identity, unspoken understanding rooted in Sicilian blood and survival instinct. These men did not trust institutions. They trusted family. Not always by blood, but by oath, the rituals of initiation, the whispered promises, the shared secrets. These became the currency of their world. A man could be poor, uneducated, or born on the street. But if he was loyal, if he followed the code, and if he proved his worth, he could become a man of honor. He could become one of us. This was the seed of La Cosa Nostra, our thing, a name that would not be widely known for decades, but one that already pulsed through the arteries of every extortion ring, gambling den, and funeral parlor that served as front operations. The Black Hand was merely the overture. What followed would be a symphony of control, silence, and blood. And yet, in these early years, the Mafia remained largely invisible to the American public. Newspapers would occasionally print headlines about bombings, about mysterious deaths, or about the Italian problem, but few understood the depth of what was building beneath the surface. Even law enforcement dismissed much of it as disorganized street crime. They could not see the outline of an empire forming. But it was there, in the whispers passed between men at the butcher shop, in the sealed envelopes exchanged behind closed doors, in the families who paid for protection, and in those who vanished when they refused. The Mafia was not yet a national force, but it was becoming a shadow government in its neighborhoods. It taxed, it punished, and it protected. And in doing so, it earned a kind of twisted legitimacy among some of the very people it preyed upon. As the Black Hand faded and the old methods gave way to more sophisticated tactics, a new generation of leaders would rise. Men like Salvatore Maranzano, Joe Masseria, and eventually Charles Lucky Luciano would take the raw materials of this violent tradition and forge them into something lethal, efficient, and nearly untouchable. But before there was structure, there was fear. Before there were titles and territories, there were letters soaked in threats and bombs planted beneath storefronts. This was the origin, the blood-soaked soil in which the Commission would one day take root. In the beginning, there was only silence, secrecy, and survival. And from that darkness, the American Mafia was born. Chapter 2: The Castellammarese War, Blood in the Streets. By the late 1920s, the underworld of New York City had matured into something more than a loose collection of extortionists and gamblers. It had evolved into a complex hierarchy of rackets, territories, and power alliances. But that evolution came at a cost. As profits soared from bootlegging, gambling, and loan sharking during the Prohibition era, so too did the ambitions of the men who ran the streets. It was a time of expansion, but also a time of reckoning. In the shadows of speakeasies and under the flickering lamplight of Mulberry Street, two titans emerged, each determined to become the unquestioned king of the American underworld. One was Joe, the boss Masseria, the other, Salvatore Maranzano, and their clash would set off one of the most violent gang wars in the history of organized crime, the Castellammarese War. At first glance, Joe Masseria did not look like a criminal mastermind. Rotund, sloppily dressed, and frequently chewing on a cigar, Masseria appeared more like a neighborhood baker than a mob boss. But appearances were deceptive. Born in Sicily and hardened on the streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side, Masseria was a brutal and cunning operator. By the 1920s, he had positioned himself as one of the most powerful figures in the New York underworld. He ruled through fear, collecting tributes from smaller gangs and consolidating power with ruthless precision. To his men, he was capo dei capi, the boss of bosses. But not everyone bowed to Masseria. In the boroughs and back alleys of New York, a quiet resistance was building. Among those leading it was Salvatore Maranzano, another Sicilian-born mafioso, who had arrived in the United States with both ambition and an ideology. Unlike Masiria, who ruled through brute force and chaos, Maranzano envisioned a mafia structured like the Roman Empire, hierarchical, disciplined, and unified. His base of power came from Castellammarese del Golfo, a town in Sicily whose men were fiercely loyal and bound by blood. To Masiria, they were a threat. To Maranzano, they were the future. The lines were drawn. What began as subtle tensions over territory and tribute soon erupted into a full-blown war. From 1929 to 1931, New York became a battlefield. Gunfire echoed through the streets, bodies turned up in alleyways and parked cars, and funerals became a common ritual in neighborhoods already steeped in poverty and fear. The Castellammarese War, named after Maranzano's Sicilian hometown, was not just a fight for power. It was a purge, a reckoning, a bloody baptism for what the American Mafia would eventually become. The war was unlike anything the underworld had seen before. It wasn't just two men feuding. It was an all-out conflict between two visions of organized crime, one rooted in the old ways of corruption and brutality, the other seeking order and long-term dominance. Over the course of 2 years, the body count climbed into the dozens. Gunmen were dispatched in broad daylight. Informants vanished without a trace. Even law enforcement, accustomed to looking the other way, could no longer ignore the scale of the violence. But they could do little to stop it. The Mafia's code of silence, reinforced by fear and loyalty, kept investigators blind and the public guessing. Masiria, desperate to maintain his grip, began making moves that only deepened the chaos. He demanded tributes from independent gangs and forced weaker factions to pledge loyalty. He became paranoid, suspicious of even his closest allies. Among those closest was a man who had been rising steadily through the ranks, a young, sharp-minded mobster named Charles Lucky Luciano. At just in his early 30s, Luciano had already made a name for himself as a shrewd and adaptable figure. He understood the old ways, but saw their limits, and he was watching the war tear everything apart. Luciano had aligned himself with Masiria, at least in appearance. But behind the scenes, he was growing tired of the bloodshed and the outdated leadership that threatened the future of organized crime. Luciano, along with contemporaries like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, envisioned something more, something bigger. They saw the war as a sickness and Masiria as its source. If the Mafia was going to survive, something had to change. Someone had to go. In the spring of 1931, the tide began to turn. Luciano secretly reached out to Maranzano. The meeting was delicate to factions, to visions, and one carefully orchestrated betrayal. Luciano made a deal. He would eliminate Masiria, ending the war, in exchange for a role in the new order Maranzano promised to build. It was a move born not just of ambition, but of necessity. The Mafia could not survive endless war. Luciano would take the future into his own hands. On April 15, 1931, the betrayal was complete. Luciano invited Masiria to a restaurant in Coney Island. They dined together, laughed, shared drinks. At one point, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. Moments later, gunmen entered the room and opened fire. Joe Masiria slumped over the table, dead, a cigar still clutched in his fingers. The war, at least in its first form, was over. Maranzano emerged as the new power broker. True to his vision, he declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He immediately set about restructuring the Mafia. He divided New York into 5 distinct families, each with its own boss, underboss, and consigliere. He implemented a system of ranks, rituals, and territories that brought order to what had been chaos. It was the beginning of the modern American Mafia, and for a brief moment, Maranzano stood alone at its pinnacle. But absolute power is a dangerous thing. Maranzano's rule, though short, quickly revealed its flaws. He was authoritarian, suspicious, and obsessed with Sicilian purity. He looked down on younger Italian Americans like Luciano, viewing them as undisciplined and untrustworthy. He began compiling lists of men he believed were threats, including Luciano and his allies. He even began planning their murders. What Maranzano failed to see was that Luciano had learned from the war and from his enemies. He understood that leadership was not taken with titles or traditions, but with action. And so, before Maranzano could strike, Luciano struck first, on September 10, 1931. Less than 5 months after Messeria's assassination, Maranzano met a similar fate. Posing as government agents, Luciano's men entered Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building. Moments later, he was stabbed and shot to death. The last of the old world dawns had fallen. The era of the mustache-Pete's traditionalist, Sicilian bosses like Messeria and Maranzano was over. A new era was about to begin. Luciano did not crown himself king. Instead, he created something far more enduring. The Commission, a governing body composed of bosses from the 5 families, along with leaders from Chicago and Buffalo. The Commission was designed to mediate disputes, approve major decisions, and prevent the kind of bloody power struggles that had just torn the Mafia apart. It was not a democracy, but it was a system, and it worked. But before that structure could rise, the streets had to be washed in blood. The Castellammarese War had been more than a gang conflict. It had been a crucible, a firestorm that burned away the old guard and gave rise to a new, corporate form of organized crime. It taught the Mafia a brutal lesson that unchecked ambition leads to chaos, and that order must be built not on fear alone, but on discipline, cooperation, and calculated violence. The war left deep scars. Families were shattered, loyalties were tested, and many who survived did so with blood on their hands and ghosts in their memories. But out of that darkness came a strange form of stability. Luciano's vision, shaped by betrayal, hardened by war, became the foundation of organized crime in America for the next 50 years. The Castellammarese War was the price of evolution. It was the blood sacrifice that made room for structure. And though its battles are now distant echoes, the choices made in those 2 years would ripple through the underworld for decades to come. In the end, it was not Messeria, and it was not Maranzano who truly won. It was the idea that the Mafia could be more than a gang. It could be a system, a shadow government, a permanent power, and it would all begin on streets once soaked in blood. Chapter 3: Lucky Luciano and the New Order. In the ashes of the Castellammarese War, a new vision for organized crime began to rise, one shaped not by tradition or bloodline, but by logic, ambition, and cold, strategic brilliance. At the center of this transformation stood a man who had emerged from the chaos, not just alive, but ascendant. Charles Lucky Luciano. To many, he was just another gangster. But to those who understood what was coming, Luciano was something more: a visionary, a reformer, and in his own ruthless way, a revolutionary. He didn't just survive the war. He rewrote the rules of the game. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, and arrived in New York at the age of 9. Like many immigrants, he found his way into crime early. He ran with street gangs on the Lower East Side, extorted classmates, and sold drugs before he could legally drink. But from the beginning, Luciano had something different. He moved with purpose. He watched, learned, and adapted. He spoke the languages of both the old world and the newer Sicilian code of honor and the American dream of power. It was this dual fluency that allowed him to navigate between cultures, earning the trust of hardened killers and polished bootleggers alike. By the time Prohibition swept across America, Luciano was already rising fast. He aligned himself with powerful men like Arnold Rothstein, the financier of the underworld, who taught him that crime wasn't just about muscle, it was about business. Rothstein gave Luciano something few gangsters possessed: a blueprint. He taught him to think in terms of infrastructure, logistics, and long-term gains. Luciano absorbed it all. And when Rothstein was murdered in 1928, Luciano didn't just mourn. He stepped into the vacuum, ready to apply what he had learned on a national scale. Luciano's true genius lay in understanding that the old Mafia model, rooted in Sicilian tradition, vendetta, and provincial loyalty, was outdated. The world had changed. The streets were no longer ruled by men in shadows, but by networks, by alliances that could stretch across boroughs, cities, even states. After orchestrating the assassinations of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, Luciano found himself in a unique position. The old bosses were gone, the families were fractured, and he alone had the credibility to pull the pieces together. But he didn't want to become another boss of all bosses. He had seen what that title did to Masseria and Maranzano. It made them targets. Instead, Luciano introduced something entirely new: the Commission. It was, in essence, a board of directors for the Mafia composed of the heads of the 5 families in New York, as well as key leaders from Chicago, Buffalo, and other major cities. The idea was simple: no one man would rule them all. Instead, power would be shared, disputes would be voted on, and executions would be approved collectively. It was organized crime transformed into corporate governance. The Commission wasn't just a safety measure, it was a stroke of brilliance. It eliminated the need for constant war. It encouraged cooperation over conquest, and it allowed for a level of coordination that had never existed before. Territories were defined, revenue streams were organized, leaders had a place to settle conflicts without resorting to bloodshed. In short, Luciano brought order to chaos, and, in doing so, he laid the foundation for the Mafia's golden age. He also made sure that the Commission's reach extended beyond Italian bloodlines. Luciano had always been pragmatic. He believed in power, not purity. He maintained close ties with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy, Siegelmen who shared his vision of a national crime syndicate. Together, they created an alliance that spanned ethnic boundaries, connecting the Italian Mafia with Jewish and Irish gangs across the country. This multi-ethnic syndicate allowed for unprecedented control over rackets ranging from narcotics to gambling, labor unions to prostitution. Money flowed like never before. Under Luciano's new order, organized crime began to mirror legitimate business. Each family operated like a franchise, with its own chain of command. Soldiers reported to capos, capos to underbosses, and underbosses to the boss. The consiglieran advisor provided counsel and mediated internal disputes. Rules were established, violations were punished. Loyalty was rewarded, and disloyalty was dealt with swiftly. For the first time, the Mafia wasn't just a loose collection of criminals. It was a system efficient, secretive, and brutally effective. Luciano also understood the value of public invisibility. Unlike Gotti decades later, who would court the press and dress like a movie star, Luciano preferred to stay in the background. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously. He moved quietly, spoke sparingly, and let his lieutenants handle the frontline work. His influence spread not through showmanship, but through structure. And as that structure solidified, so did his legacy. The transformation wasn't just philosophical, it was financial. With prohibition in full swing, the Mafia became one of the largest suppliers of illegal alcohol in the nation. Luciano and his allies used fleets of trucks, secret warehouses, and bribed officials to move liquor from Canada and the Midwest into New York's underground bars. The profits were astronomical. But Luciano didn't squander the money on short-term pleasure. He reinvested it into casinos, unions, trucking companies, and legitimate businesses that could launder cash and generate influence. One of his most powerful moves was infiltrating labor unions. Through control of the International Longshoremen's Association and the Teamsters, Luciano could dictate the flow of goods through the ports and across highways. This gave the Mafia leverage over shipping companies, construction firms, and even Hollywood studios. In time, the Mafia's influence would touch every major industry in America, and it all began with Luciano's vision born not in boardrooms, but in alleys, forged in blood and refined by strategy. Despite his growing empire, Luciano's reign was not without threat. In the mid-1930s, Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey began a campaign to bring him down. Dewey was young, ambitious, and determined to make a name for himself by targeting organized crime. In 1936, he succeeded. Luciano was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution, a case built in part on testimony from women who claimed to have been forced into sex work under his network. Luciano maintained his innocence, arguing that the charges were manufactured, but it didn't matter. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Even behind bars, Luciano remained a force. He continued to manage affairs through intermediaries. His influence never disappeared. In fact, his power only grew in myth and memory. During World War II, Luciano even struck a deal with the US government, offering intelligence and security through his contacts on the New York waterfront to protect against Axis sabotage. In exchange, his sentence was commuted, and in 1946, he was deported to Italy, exiled but not silenced. Luciano spent the rest of his life watching the empire he helped build evolve and expand. He lived quietly in Naples, occasionally involved in drug trafficking and mafia politics, but never again at the center. He died in 1962, at the age of 64, of a heart attack at Naples airport. He was waiting to meet an American producer who wanted to make a film about his life. Fittingly, he died on the edge of myths between truth and legend. But his legacy was not confined to stories or cinema. Luciano had re-engineered the Mafia into something enduring, something that could outlast him. The Commission continued to operate long after his departure, resolving disputes, maintaining order, and ensuring that power remained balanced among the families. His model allowed the Mafia to survive waves of arrests, assassinations, and political pressure. It gave it a center, a process, and a permanence. Charles Lucky Luciano did not invent organized crime in America, but he perfected it. He took a world of chaos and shaped it into a machina-silent empire ruled by consensus, structure, and the cold logic of power. He understood that violence could win you a corner, but only vision could win you a kingdom. In the quiet rooms where decisions were made, where fates were sealed with nods and silence, Luciano's influence was present. It lingered in the protocols, the rituals, the very architecture of the underworld. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the architect of the new order, and through that order, he built something that, though invisible to most, would shape American history in ways no one could ignore. The Commission would go on to dominate the criminal landscape for decades, but at its core, at its genesis, was one man who saw what others didn't, a man who dared to think bigger, a man who, against all odds, lived long enough to witness the legacy of his own revolution. That man was Lucky Luciano, and the order he left behind was no longer a gang, it was a government in the shadows. Chapter 4. The Five Families' Power Divided. When the dust of the Castellammarese War finally settled, and the blood had dried on the streets of New York, what emerged was not peace, but balance. It was a fragile balance, forged not by the absence of ambition, but by its careful redirection. Charles Lucky Luciano understood that the chaos of unchecked power was bad for business. He knew that the violence which had once secured dominance now threatened to destroy the entire foundation of organized crime. So, with the creation of the Commission, he set into motion a plan to divide power, not eliminate it. And at the heart of that plan stood 5 pillars, 5 criminal dynasties that would rule over New York like silent monarchies. The 5 families, Lucchese, Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo, each with its own structure, its own code, and its own domain. Together, they would become the foundation of American organized crime. The origin of the 5 families was not ceremonial. There were no parades, no public declarations. It was simply a restructuring GA division of what had once been turf fought over with bullets and betrayal. Luciano believed that by assigning each family a clear territory, a hierarchy, and a seat at the table, he could prevent future wars and maximize profits. Each family would be autonomous, but also accountable to the larger commission. Internal affairs would be managed privately, but major decisions, especially those involving murder or expansion, had to go through the board. It was organized. Crime turned into a federation. The Genovese family, once headed by Luciano himself, was the first and most powerful. After Luciano's deportation, control eventually passed to Vito Genovese, a cold and calculating figure who would give the family its lasting name. Genovese was old-school Sicilian, obsessed with control and hierarchy. Under his rule, the family expanded its grip on narcotics, gambling, and labor racketeering. Its reach extended deep into the Teamsters Union, the docks, and even international drug routes. The Genovese family would earn a reputation as the most secretive and disciplined of the 5. They didn't make headlines. They made history from the shadows. Then there was the Gambino family, named after Carlo Gambino, who rose to power in the 1950s. Gambino was quiet, strategic, and ruthlessly efficient. Unlike many of his peers, he kept a low profile, avoiding the spotlight and cultivating an image of modesty. But behind that facade was an empire built on loan sharking, extortion, and influence over the garment district. Gambino's power surged in the post-war years, particularly after he maneuvered to have his ally Paul Castellano succeed him, ensuring that control remained within his orbit. The Gambino family would go on to become the most financially successful and publicly known family in Mafia history, eventually producing figures like John Gotti, who would shatter Luciano's vision of quiet leadership. The Lucchese family, led initially by Gaetano Tommy Lucchese, was known for its smooth operation and quiet brutality. Lucchese was the consummate diplomat, a man who made friends in high places and ran his organization like a corporation. His control over the construction unions and trucking companies made him indispensable in New York's booming post-war economy. Under Lucchese's leadership, the family maintained a reputation for pragmatism and profit. They avoided unnecessary violence, focused on making money, and built an efficient machine that thrived well into the 1960s and beyond. The Bonanno family, founded by Joseph Bonanno, had its roots in the Castellammarese faction that helped Luciano topple the old regime. Bonanno was younger than many of his contemporaries, and his rise to power came with both ambition and idealism. He saw the Mafia as a sacred institution, bound by honor, tradition, and family. But those ideals would later lead to division, especially when Bonanno attempted to consolidate more power than the Commission allowed. The resulting Banana War would shake the Mafia to its core, pitting family against family and nearly destroying the delicate balance that Luciano had established. Lastly, the Colombo family, originally known as the Profaci family, began under the leadership of Joe Profacia, devout Catholic and old-school mobster, who mixed religious piety with ruthless racketeering. Profaci controlled a variety of lucrative enterprises, including olive oil imports, which earned him the nickname the Olive Oil King. But his grip on power would later be challenged by Joseph Colombo, a rising capo who eventually took over the family and became one of the few bosses to publicly associate his name with the organization. Colombo's creation of the Italian-American Civil Rights League would draw massive attention and unwanted FBI scrutiny, ultimately leading to an attempt on his life that left him permanently disabled. Each of the five families had its own personality, its own legacy, but together they formed a council of kings. They ruled their respective boroughs and rackets like territories in an empire, with the understanding that peace among them meant profit for all. This equilibrium, though fragile, endured for decades. It allowed the Mafia to embed itself into the fabric of New York City life. Garbage collection, construction contracts, union elections, even political campaigns. Nothing happened without their approval, their payment, or their silence. The influence of the five families didn't end in New York. Their reach extended nationally through alliances with crime syndicates in Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Los Angeles. They worked with Lansky's syndicate to control casinos in Las Vegas and Havana. They infiltrated Hollywood through labor unions. They corrupted politicians, police officers, and judges. In some cities, their power was so entrenched that the Mafia functioned as an invisible government, one that did not campaign or legislate, but enforced its will with whispers and bullets. What made this system so effective was its consistency. Each family had a defined chain of command. Orders flowed down. Money flowed up. Soldiers were expected to earn and remain loyal. Capos were held responsible for their crews. Bosses governed with quiet authority, backed by the threat of violent enforcement. Internal disputes were handled discreetly, and when diplomacy failed, permission to kill had to come from the Commission. This bureaucracy of blood ensured that chaos remained contained. It turned violence into a controlled commodity. But even within this structure, tensions simmered. Rivalries emerged. Greed tempted men to overreach. Informants became a growing concern as law enforcement pressure mounted in the 1950s and 60s. The families would occasionally clash, sometimes subtly through business maneuvers, other times openly through hits and power plays. Yet the overall framework held. It held because the five families understood something fundamental. Their individual survival depended on the survival of the system. The commission was the glue that bound them, the referee in their conflicts, the guardian of the order Luciano had imagined. It met in secret, sometimes in apartments, sometimes in hotel rooms, always far from prying eyes. Membership was limited to bosses. Decisions were made through consensus. There were no minutes, no records, only decisions, delivered face to face, enforced without delay. It was a system built on trust, fear, and an understanding that no man, no matter how powerful, was bigger than the organization. By the 1950s, the five families had become cultural myths, phantoms that haunted headlines and whispered through neighborhoods. To the public, they were folklore. To the FBI, they were a puzzle wrapped in silence. And to those within, they were everything. They provided wealth, respect, and identity. But they also demanded absolute loyalty. To betray the family was to sign your death warrant. The rules were clear. And for decades, they worked. The five families were more than criminal organizations. They were dynasties interwoven with the economic, political, and social fabric of American life. They corrupted what could be corrupted. They controlled what could be controlled. And they did so with a code that mixed honor and horror, tradition and terror. It was a world where loyalty was everything and disloyalty unforgivable. As time passed, new names would rise within each family, new bosses, new capos. Some would lead with discipline, others with recklessness, but the structure remained. The system endured, because the vision Luciano had set forth was bigger than any one man. It was a design that allowed the Mafia to survive across generations through war, investigation, betrayal, and time itself. This chapter in the Mafia's history, the creation of the five families, was the formalization of power. It was the moment the underworld stopped acting like a gang and started operating like a nation. Silent borders were drawn, invisible laws were written, and for nearly half a century, those five families ruled New York from the shadows, turning crime into industry, loyalty into law, and violence into policy. They were not just men, they were institutions, and their legacy would shape the American underworld in ways no one, not the law, not the government, not even the commission itself could ever fully contain. Chapter 5: The National Syndicate. Mafia meets the mob. In the criminal underworld of early 20th century America, lines were sharply drawn, not just between gangs, but between cultures, traditions, and bloodlines. The Italian Mafia clung to its old world codes. The Jewish mob moved with the rhythm of the American streets. The Irish had their own violent legacy rooted in politics and unions. Each group kept to its own, fueled by mistrust, rivalry, and territorial instinct. But amid the chaos, one man saw something different. Charles "Lucky" Luciano understood that the future of organized crime didn't lie in old rivalries. It lay in unity, in business, and in building something larger than any one family, race, or borough. That vision became reality through a historic alliance, an unprecedented partnership between Italian and Jewish gangsters that gave rise to a criminal superstructure known as the National Syndicate. This wasn't just a pact. It was a seismic shift in the American underworld. At its heart was a trio of minds and muscles. Lucky Luciano, the strategic architect of the five families. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius from the Lower East Side. And Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, the brutal and charismatic enforcer with a taste for flash. Together, they forged a partnership that transcended tradition. They merged old-school mafia structure with street-smart Jewish enterprise. The result was a nationwide criminal empire networked, diversified, and nearly untouchable. Meyer Lansky, born Meyer Sokoljanski in Grodno, Poland, had fled anti-Semitic violence with his family and landed in New York as a child. He was slight in stature but sharp in mind. By the time he was a teenager, Lansky had already earned a reputation as a numbers whiz and a cool-headed strategist. He rejected the random violence of street gangs and preferred precision, planning, and profits. Where others saw chaos, Lansky saw opportunity. He partnered early with Bugsy Siegel, his childhood friend, forming a bond rooted in loyalty and an unspoken understanding of the game. Together, they dominated illegal gambling operations and began laying the groundwork for something far greater. Luciano met Lansky in the early 1920s, and their relationship quickly grew from respect into strategic alliance. They were opposites in many ways. Luciano, the charismatic Sicilian with street muscle, Lansky, the reserved intellectual with a business mind, but they shared one critical belief, that money was colorblind. In their eyes, race, religion, and ethnicity were obstacles only for those too small-minded to see the bigger picture. Crime, like business, needed to evolve. Their first real collaboration came during Prohibition. Together, they built a bootlegging empire that stretched from Canada to Florida, using bribes, violence, and logistical precision to flood American cities with illegal liquor. They controlled fleets of trucks, smuggling routes, warehouses, and even their own bottling plants. The profits were staggering. But more importantly, the operation proved that cross-ethnic cooperation could work. Italian muscle protected the roots. Jewish brains handled the books. Everyone earned, and when disputes arose, they were handled quietly with logic, not blood. The success of their bootlegging operations laid the foundation for what would become known as the National Syndicate, a loose but powerful federation of criminal enterprises spanning the country. At its core was an understanding, cooperation over competition. Territory would be respected, disputes would be mediated, profits would be shared. It wasn't a formal structure like the Commission, but it was equally effective. From New York to Chicago, from Miami to Los Angeles, organized crime began to operate like a national corporation, diverse, disciplined, and deadly. Bugsy Siegel played a unique role in this alliance. Where Lansky was measured and methodical, Siegel was bold and unpredictable. He thrived on danger, lived fast, and dressed like a movie star, but beneath the charm was a savage enforcer. He didn't hesitate to kill, and his reputation made him indispensable. Siegel became the syndicate's ambassador to the West Coast, expanding operations into California, where Hollywood's glitz provided the perfect cover for gambling, extortion, and narcotics trafficking. He rubbed elbows with actors, dated starlets, and built connections between organized crime and America's entertainment capital. But Siegel's most ambitious and, ultimately, doomed venture would be in the deserts of Nevada. With Lansky and Luciano's blessing, Siegel spearheaded the construction of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, envisioning a gambling mecca that would attract high rollers, celebrities, and tourists. It was a bold move, one that required significant investment and delicate political maneuvering. At first, the syndicate supported him, but delays, cost overruns, and suspicions of skimming eventually turned support into suspicion. In 1947, Siegel was assassinated, shot through the head while reading a newspaper in his girlfriend's Beverly Hills home. No one was ever charged, but the message was clear. In the syndicate, no man was bigger than the organization. Still, Siegel's death didn't stop the dream. It cemented it. Las Vegas would grow into the gambling capital of the world, built on syndicate money and protected by syndicate muscle. Casinos became laundromats for illicit cash. Politicians were bought. Law enforcement was compromised. All of it tied back to the alliance that Luciano had helped build. The National Syndicate wasn't a gang. It was an economic force, one that infiltrated unions, industries, and institutions. It ran numbers rackets in Harlem, controlled horse betting in Miami, managed port operations in New Orleans, and facilitated heroin trafficking routes that stretched across continents. Lansky, ever the tactician, ensured that the syndicate's financial empire was carefully structured. He pioneered offshore banking, using accounts in Switzerland and the Caribbean to launder money and hide profits. He invested in legitimate businesses, ensuring that criminal profits were reinvested into real estate, hotels, and stocks. It was Lansky who turned organized crime into a shadow economy, one that mirrored legitimate capitalism, complete with diversification, reinvestment, and risk management. The influence of the National Syndicate even reached into politics. Through bribery and blackmail, the syndicate exerted pressure on local and national politicians. They had judges on their payroll, police chiefs in their pockets, and union bosses under their control. In some cities, elections were decided not by votes, but by orders handed down from back rooms. The syndicate didn't just break the law, it rewrote the rules. Despite its reach, the syndicate operated largely in silence. Unlike the volatile street gangs of the past, this new alliance favored stability. Hits were rare, calculated, and approved only when necessary. Meetings were secret. Business was prioritized. And while the FBI and local law enforcement were aware of its existence, they struggled to understand its scale. The syndicate wasn't centralized. It didn't wear colors or fly flags. It was a constellation of alliances, bound by profit, protected by fear, and enforced through absolute discipline. Luciano's role in this national web was pivotal. Even after his imprisonment and deportation, though physically distant, he remained a spiritual leader, consulted on major decisions, and respected by all factions. He understood that power wasn't in presence, but in influence. His dream of a unified, efficient underworld was no longer just a dream. It was reality. The National Syndicate wasn't just a merger of Italian and Jewish criminal empires. It was a blueprint, a model that showed the American underworld how to evolve through collaboration, diversification, and a relentless focus on profit. It turned gangs into conglomerates, thugs into businessmen, and crime into industry. It was the beginning of the Mafia's transformation from street-level brutality to boardroom-level control. But with success came scrutiny. The government began to notice. Journalists whispered of invisible empires. Law enforcement agencies, once fragmented and underfunded, started connecting the dots. And while the syndicate had bought itself time, its growing visibility would eventually make it a target. For now, though, it thrived. In smoke-filled rooms, on phone lines hidden behind front businesses, in coded conversations passed between cities, the syndicate operated like a second economy. It was resilient, calculating, and unlike anything America had seen before. It didn't belong to one family, one city, or one ethnicity. It was a network in alliance, forged in blood and built on trust. The National Syndicate was proof that crime, like any enterprise, could be scaled. All it took was vision, discipline, and the willingness to break the old rules. And in the quiet offices where the real decisions were made, One truth echoed louder than any gunshot: united, they could control everything, from the back alleys of Brooklyn to the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, from union halls in Chicago to offshore banks in the Caribbean. The National Syndicate became the invisible force behind America's underworld economy. It was no longer just organized crime. It was criminal capitalism at its peak. And it all began with an unlikely alliance between a Sicilian gangster, a Jewish accountant, and a dream that reached far beyond the streets. Chapter 6: The Commission, America's Criminal Boardroom. In the smoky back rooms of New York's underworld, where whispers carried more weight than gunfire, something extraordinary took shape in 1931. After years of bloodshed, betrayal, and chaos, the American Mafia did what few criminal organizations in history had ever dared to do. It created order, not through surrender or compromise, but through design. Out of the ashes of the Castellammarese War, Lucky Luciano didn't just seize power, he institutionalized it. He abolished the outdated title of boss of bosses and replaced it with a new concept: a governing council of equals. A structure that would oversee the affairs of the underworld with the cold precision of a corporate boardroom. It was called the Commission. This wasn't a myth or a vague idea, was real. A formal body that operated in secret, composed of the most powerful mafia bosses in the country. It had no office, no paper trail, no official record, and yet it ruled the American underworld with ruthless, disciplined efficiency. Its purpose was clear: to manage disputes, approve major business deals, authorize hits, and maintain balance among the five families and their allies. It was government in the shadows, without democracy, without mercy, but with an order that made the Mafia stronger than ever before. The Commission was built on a simple but brilliant idea: decentralization of power. No one man would ever again hold supreme authority. Instead, representatives from each of the five families, Genoese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, would sit as equals. The bosses of Chicago's Outfit and Buffalo's Magadena crime family also had seats, giving it national reach. Together, these men governed the syndicate like shareholders in a corporation. Major decisions required a consensus. Murder required approval. Expansion into new territories demanded discussion. There were no formal elections, no public meetings. Everything was done face to face, behind closed doors, under absolute secrecy. Each boss on the Commission brought with him a vast web of soldiers, captains, and associates. But inside the boardroom, those external powers were left at the door. It was a council of kings, each ruling their own domain, yet bound by shared interest. It was this collective design that prevented another all-out war. When tensions flared, when blood threatened to spill again over a loan-sharking dispute or a territory violation, the bosses didn't turn to bullets, they turned to the Commission. Structure was everything. Each family operated under a strict hierarchy. At the top sat the boss, who made final decisions and held absolute authority within his family. Beneath him was the underboss, the second in command, who managed daily operations and could step in if the boss was imprisoned or killed. Then came the consigliere, the trusted advisor, often older and experienced, who served as a counselor and mediator in internal disputes. Below them were the caparigins captains who controlled crews of soldiers and associates. Orders flowed down, money flowed up. But when it came to family matters, inter-family murders, large-scale rackets, or expansion beyond established borders, the Commission had final say. It was not a democratic body, but it was a stabilizing one. It enforced a code that emphasized discretion, respect, and order. Hits on high-ranking members of other families could not be carried out without permission. If someone went rogue, if a soldier broke protocol or brought too much heat, that too went to the commission. And when consensus was reached, enforcement followed swiftly and without hesitation. No warnings, no appeals, just silence and then death. In many ways, the commission functioned like the Supreme Court of the underworld. Its power wasn't just in its ability to punish, but in its ability to prevent conflict. By offering a platform where disputes could be aired, where grievances could be judged by peers, it minimized unnecessary bloodshed. This was the genius of Luciano's creation. He had seen what unchecked power could do: assassinations, the paranoia, the endless war. The commission changed all that. It didn't eliminate violence. It made it purposeful. Meetings were rare and carefully orchestrated. Locations rotated: hotel suites, private homes, sometimes even funeral parlors. Communication was handled through trusted intermediaries, often consiglieri or underbosses. Every word mattered. Every gesture was loaded. To break protocol was to risk death. And yet, through this system, the Mafia thrived. It grew more organized, more powerful, more entrenched in American life. The Commission's influence extended far beyond New York. Through partnerships with Meyer Lansky, Chicago's outfit, and other criminal groups across the country, it became the nerve center of a national criminal empire. It coordinated efforts in narcotics, trafficking, gambling, union racketeering, and labor extortion. It had ties to corrupt politicians, law enforcement officials, and even elements of U.S. intelligence during World War II. Its reach was vast, but invisible. That was its strength, its genius. One of the most infamous decisions ever handed down by the Commission came in 1957, when it sanctioned the murder of Albert Anastasia, the feared boss of the Gambino family and co-founder of Murder, Inc. Anastasia had become erratic, unpredictable. His appetite for violence and disregard for the new order made him a liability. The Commission didn't hesitate. The hit was approved. And one October morning, Anastasia was gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop, his blood mixing with shaving cream as bullets tore through his skull. It was a message. No one, no matter how feared, was above the system. Another key moment came later that same year, when law enforcement stumbled upon the infamous Apalachin Meeting in upstate New York. Over 60 high-ranking Mafia members had gathered to discuss business. When state troopers raided the property, gangsters fled through the woods in suits and leather shoes, exposing for the first time the full scope of the National Syndicate. It was the first public crack in the Commission's armor. The government now knew what it was up against, but still, the system held. The Commission's strength lay not in force, but in logic. It created an incentive for cooperation. It made violence the last resort, not the first. It treated crime like commerce and bosses like CEOs. But with that came a chilling efficiency. Justice was not debated. It was delivered swiftly, silently, and without mercy. The Commission also had rules that extended into the personal lives of its members. No talking to the press, no drawing unnecessary attention, no involvement with narcotics at least in the early years, when the heat from federal agencies made drug trafficking too risky. These weren't moral stances, they were risk calculations. Every rule had a purpose. Every line drawn was to protect the structure. Those who disobeyed faced one fat erasure. But even perfection cracks. Over time, the same rules that brought balance also bred resentment. Younger mobsters chafed under the weight of the old system. Some saw the commission not as a council of order, but as a relic of a bygone era. The seeds of rebellion began to grow, and as law enforcement became more sophisticated using wiretaps, surveillance, and informants, the shadows that once protected the commission began to recede. Yet, for decades, the commission remained untouchable. It was the reason the Mafia could survive internal feuds, government crackdowns, and generational turnover. It was the backbone of organized crime's golden age. A hidden government that ruled by blood, but operated like business. It was elegant in its simplicity, terrifying in its control. In its prime, the commission was not just feared, it was revered. Within the Mafia, its word was law. Outside of it, it was a myth whispered by agents, feared by prosecutors, and misunderstood by the public. It didn't need a building. It didn't need uniforms. It needed only loyalty, discipline, and the silent agreement of powerful men who understood that peace, in this world, came only through control. Today, its legacy is one of paradox. The commission brought order but enforced it through murder. It prevented war but sanctioned death. It gave structure to chaos, but ruled without accountability. And in doing so, it became one of the most effective criminal institutions in modern history. The commission didn't just oversee organized crime, it was organized crime. An empire built in darkness, governed by silence, and remembered in blood. Chapter 7. Murder Inc., the enforcement arm of the Mafia in the world of organized crime. Power means nothing without control. Order means nothing without fear. And silence is everything. For the commission to function as the invisible government of America's underworld, it needed more than strategy, more than alliances. It needed a weapon. A force capable of enforcing its will without question, without warning, without mercy. That weapon took shape in the late 1930s. Behind shuttered storefronts in Brooklyn and back alleys across the city, it was known by a name that struck fear from coast to coast: Murder, Incorporated. Murder, Inc. was not a family. It wasn't bound by bloodlines or boroughs. It was something far more dangerous, an idea, institutionalized. It was the Mafia's outsourced death squad, a cadre of professional killers who answered to no one but the higher powers of the commission. Their job wasn't to make money. It wasn't to negotiate or expand territory. Their sole purpose was to eliminate problems ruthlessly, efficiently, and invisibly. The origins of Murder, Inc. can be traced to the leadership of Louis Lepch Buchalter and Albert Anastasia. Lep, a Jewish gangster with a sharp mind for labor racketeering, had built an empire by controlling unions, especially in the garment district. Anastasia, an Italian enforcer and rising star in the Mafia, had a gift for violence that bordered on obsession. Together, they saw an opportunity to streamline execution, to take murder once chaotic, impulsive, and personal and turn it into a regulated, professional service. At its height, Murder Inc. was believed to have consisted of as many as 200 hitmen. Many were Jewish and Italian street soldiers, mostly from Brownsville, Brooklyn men like Abe Kidd, Twist Reels, Harry Pittsburgh, Phil Strauss, and Frank Aben. They had no titles, no turf, no crews. They lived modestly, blending into working-class neighborhoods. But when the call came, they moved without hesitation. Whether it was a stool pigeon, a rebellious soldier, or a rival boss, Murder Inc. made the problem disappear. Permanently, These weren't crimes of passion, they were assignments, approved by the higher-ups, sanctioned by the commission, and executed with clinical precision. Victims were trailed for days, sometimes weeks, patterns studied, routines memorized. When the moment was right, the kill was delivered quietly, quickly, and without trace. Ice picks, piano wire, silenced pistols. These weren't gangland shootouts, they were surgical strikes. What made Murder, Inc. so effective wasn't just their brutality, was their detachment. They killed without personal motive, without hesitation. Their loyalty wasn't to any one family, but to the system. In a sense, they were the custodians of order. By eliminating threats before they could fester, they kept the machine running smoothly. They were violent, weaponized, and purified. They were fear made flesh. The killers were paid per job, usually a few $1,000s, depending on the profile of the target. Sometimes they were sent across state lines: Chicago, Detroit, Miami. They traveled by bus or train, carrying nothing but a name and an address. Once the job was done, they vanished back into the noise of the city. There were no boasts, no celebrations, only silence, and in that silence, power. For years, the authorities had no idea such an organization even existed. Murders were chalked up to rivalries, street beefs, or personal grudges. But the pattern was there: dozens, then hundreds, of homicides across the country with one thing in common: no suspects, no witnesses, and no mistakes. It was as if the victims had simply vanished, like chalk wiped clean from a board. The man who would eventually pull back the curtain was one of their own. Abe "Kid" Twist Reels, a wiry, street-smart hitman with a reputation for brutality and a fearsome temper. In 1940, Reels was arrested for murder. Facing the electric chair and abandoned by his handlers, Reels did the unthinkable. He talked, and when he did, the myth of Murder, Inc. exploded into public view. Reels gave names, dates, details. He described killings in chilling, step-by-step precision. He laid out how Murder, Inc. operated, how contracts were delivered, who approved them, how the killers moved, and where the bodies were buried. For law enforcement, it was like uncovering a secret army, one that had been hiding in plain sight. His testimony led to dozens of indictments. Louis Lepke Buchalter was tried and convicted, becoming the first major crime boss to be executed in the electric chair. Harry Strauss, Frank Abendondo, and others followed. But before the full damage could be done, something or someone silenced Reels. In 1941, while under heavy police protection in a guarded hotel room, Reels mysteriously fell to his death from a window. Officials called it an escape attempt. The streets called it what it was: a hit. Reels was set to testify against Albert Anastasia, the co-creator of Murder, Inc. His death ended the case before it could begin. No charges, no conviction, no justice, just silence. The message was clear: the commission would protect its own, even from a prison cell. Especially from a prison cell. After Reels' fall, Murder, Inc. began to unravel. The arrests, the press, the paranoia, it all became too visible. The commission, valuing discretion above all, quietly dismantled the formal structure. The era of centrally organized contract killings was over, but the idea lived on. The Mafia would continue to use trusted enforcers to carry out murders, but never again under one name, one roof, or one system. Murder, Inc. had done its job too well. Still, its legacy endured. It changed how the Mafia killed. Before Murder, Inc., a hit was often emotional, improvised. After Murder, Inc., it became a calculated transaction, risk assessed, pre-approved, and delegated. It brought discipline to murder. It made death a line item in the budget of organized crime. The public was horrified. The press, once focused on petty gang fights and liquor busts, now had a new obsession. The headlines were relentless: Murder, Inc., strikes again, Brooklyn's butchers, the Syndicate's death factory. For the first time, Americans saw the Mafia not as isolated gangs, but as an organized, nationwide enterprise with its own judicial arm. It was no longer folklore, it was real, and it was terrifying. Law enforcement, too, was forced to adapt. The creation of Murder, Inc. pushed agencies to think beyond local turf wars and petty crime. It helped birth the modern concept of organized crime as a national threat. It led to the expansion of federal investigations, the formation of special crime units, and, eventually, the use of RICO laws. Decades later, Murder, Inc. may have ended, but it left behind a blueprint not just for the Mafia, but for those trying to stop it. Albert Anastasia, though spared prosecution in the 1940s, would eventually meet his end in true underworld fashion. In 1957, he was gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop while waiting for a shave. The man who had helped create the most feared enforcement unit in Mafia history died the way he had lived, by the blade. Without warning. In the history of American crime, few chapters are darker than that of Murder, Inc. It wasn't just the scale of the killings, it was the purpose. The cold, emotionless efficiency. The way death became policy. For the Commission, it was a necessary evil, a tool to maintain order, enforce silence, and protect the system. For the public, it was a revelation. Proof that the Mafia wasn't just violent, it was organized. Today, the name still lingers in the collective memory like a ghost, a whisper from a time when the underworld didn't just punish betrayal, it erased it, when killers moved in shadows, spoke in codes, and answered only to the unseen hands above. Murder, Inc. didn't survive, but its spirit never really died. It was absorbed back into the bloodstream of organized crime, quieter, smarter, deadlier, because the truth is, in the Mafia, violence is never personal. It's procedural, a tool, a line on a ledger. And in its purest, most terrifying form, it was Murder, Incorporated. Chapter 8. Las Vegas, building Sin City, in the barren heat of the Nevada desert. Under a sky that shimmered like polished steel, a mirage began to take shape. It was not born of nature, but of vision, of greed, ambition, and cold-blooded calculation. It would become a place where vice wore a tuxedo, where sin was legalized and sold by the hour. A city built on illusion, sustained by excess, and owned, from the beginning, by the underworld. This was Las Vegas, and it would not exist, not as we know it, without the Mafia. Long before the neon lights, before the showgirls and slot machines, Vegas was just a dusty outpost, a stopover on the Union Pacific Line. But in 1931, two events changed its destiny forever. The state of Nevada legalized gambling, and the Hoover Dam brought thousands of workers and their paychecks into the region. Almost overnight, opportunity glittered in the dust, and no one saw that glitter more clearly than the men who had already mastered the business of vice. At the center of this transformation stood Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky, the financial architect of the National Syndicate, saw the desert as fertile ground for laundering money and expanding the reach of organized crime. Siegel, his volatile but visionary partner, saw more than just casinos. He saw a city built from scratch, under the syndicate's control, with luxury, seduction, and profit baked into its foundation. The syndicate had already tested its grip on gambling. Illegal casinos in New York, Miami, and Havana were proving enormously profitable. But Vegas offered something different. It was legal, regulated, at least on paper. And that meant the Mafia could move their operations into the light without surrendering their darkness. Bugsy Siegel, ever the showman, was the ideal frontman for this new venture. He arrived in Las Vegas in the mid-1940s, wearing custom suits and speaking in deals, not dreams. He charmed local officials, bought influence, and set plans in motion for a new kind of casino, one that offered luxury, not just gambling. It would be called the Flamingo, a resort, not a backroom, a palace in the sand. Behind the scenes, the money flowed from back east. The commission approved the investment, and major crime families, Genovese Lansky's, syndicate allies, and others backed the construction. Millions were funneled into the project, some through legitimate loans, most through hidden channels. But Siegel's ambition outpaced his discipline. Costs spiraled, delays mounted. What was supposed to be a streamlined operation turned into a financial black hole. The Flamingo opened in December 1946, unfinished and underwhelming. The opening night was a disaster. Rain poured, celebrities cancelled, and gamblers stayed away. Siegel was furious, humiliated. He pushed forward, determined to prove everyone wrong. And he nearly did. Within a few months, the Flamingo began turning a profit. The vision was coming to life. But it was too late. By then, suspicions had taken root. The backers in New York believed Siegel was skimming from the project, possibly even planning to cut them out. The Mafia didn't need proof, just suspicion. In June 1947, Siegel was assassinated, shot through the head, while sitting in the Beverly Hills home of his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. The hit was clean, clinical. The message was final. But Siegel's death did not mark the end of the dream. In fact, it cleared the way for total control. With Bugsy gone, Lansky and his allies took over the Flamingo's operations, stabilizing the business and installing trusted managers. And from that moment on, the Mafia's grip on Las Vegas only tightened. The skimming system was genius in its simplicity. The casino brought in millions in cash, no receipts, no records. Before any money was officially counted, a percentage was pulled from the top. That money was then sent back east, hidden in trucks, suitcases, and sometimes handed by couriers. It never appeared on any books. It never existed to auditors. But it made the families rich. Very rich. Each casino operated under this silent agreement. In exchange for funding and protection, the mob would get its cut. Security was provided, not just by guards, but by fear. Employees who talked disappeared. Union bosses were bought. State officials looked the other way. Vegas ran on silence, loyalty, and the unspoken rule that the house never loses. And the mob never forgets. By the 1950s and 60s, Las Vegas was booming. Casinos like the Sands, the Riviera, the Tropicana, and the Stardust dotted the strip, each with ties to different crime families. Celebrities performed nightly. Tourists poured in. And all the while, the Mafia collected their quiet dividend. Lansky remained the brain behind the curtain. Though he never officially owned anything in Vegas, he controlled more than most understood. He structured the offshore accounts, managed investments, and ensured that the money moved cleanly. To the IRS, Lansky was a retired businessman. To the underworld, he was the banker of the mob, The reach of organized crime extended into every corner of Vegas life. Judges were bribed. Gaming officials were compromised. Loan sharking operations flourished in casino lobbies. And when someone crossed the line, they didn't get a phone call, they got a hole in the desert. Vegas was no longer just a city. It was a kingdom. And the Mafia wore the crown. The FBI knew what was happening. They watched, listened, tapped phones, built files. But Vegas was slippery. No one talked. No one wrote anything down. And the profits were so immense that even those tasked with enforcement sometimes found themselves compromised. For years, the mob operated with near impunity, making Las Vegas a shining example of organized crime's reach and its restraint. But time changes everything. By the 1970s, federal agencies began to catch up. The government introduced RICO laws, and wiretaps began cracking the code of silence. Informants flipped. Books were seized, and slowly, the structure that had sustained the Mafia's reign began to erode. Casinos were bought by corporations, regulations tightened, and legitimate money began to replace the old blood money. Still, the legacy of what the mob built in Las Vegas remains. They took a nowhere town in the middle of the desert and turned it into an empire. They saw opportunity in isolation, profit in vice. They gambled on the future and, for decades, they won. Las Vegas was not born out of dust. It was carved from it. With bullets and ledgers, bribes and concrete. It was not a city that grew naturally. It was constructed like a con, like a scheme. And behind every flickering light, every ringing slot machine, every tuxedoed dealer, there was a silent partner, the commission. What the Mafia built in Vegas wasn't just a gambling operation. It was a prototype, a way to legitimize crime, to institutionalize it, to wrap it in tuxedos and martinis. And for a time, it worked, until it didn't. But even as the mob's influence waned, their fingerprints remained in the foundations, in the legend, in the myth of Sin City. Because Las Vegas isn't just a city, it's a monument to ambition, to corruption, to the dangerous brilliance of men who saw the future and made it theirs, one hotel, one bet, one silent deal at a time. The Mafia didn't just take a gamble on Las Vegas. They built the table, they stacked the deck, and for nearly half a century, they were the house. And the house always wins. Chapter 9. Infiltrating Unions, the mob in labor. Beneath the hum of industry and the clang of steel, in the cities that built America's skyline and filled its ports, another kind of engine was at work, silent, unseen, and far more dangerous. While laborers moved crates, poured concrete, and paved roads, the Mafia moved money, influence, and control. This wasn't done at gunpoint or from the shadows. It was done through paperwork, contracts, pensions, and threats whispered at union meetings. The commission didn't just infiltrate labor. It institutionalized it. It made the unions theirs, tools for extortion, vehicles for power, and pipelines for untouchable wealth. In post-war America, labor unions were more than just advocates for workers' rights. They were powerful entities that shaped entire industries. From the docks of New York to the construction sites of Chicago, unions could bring commerce to a halt or move it like clockwork. That kind of leverage didn't go unnoticed by organized crime. And under the Commission's direction, the five families embedded themselves deep within the muscle and bureaucracy of the American workforce. No union was more critical to this plan than the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, with roots in transportation and logistics. The Teamsters controlled the lifeblood of the American economy: trucks, warehouses, and the movement of goods across state lines. And at the center of it all was a man who became a symbol of both labor's strength and its vulnerability. James R. Hoffa. Hoffa was not a mobster. He was a born organizer, a relentless negotiator, and a working-class icon. But he was also a man who understood the value of alliances. To grow the Teamsters into the most powerful union in the country, he needed help: political, financial, and sometimes physical, and the mob was more than willing to provide it. From the early 1950s, the Mafia began quietly investing in Hoffa's rise. They provided muscle at rallies, helped silence dissenters, and ensured loyalty where it mattered most, at the local level. In return, Hoffa opened the doors of the Teamsters' vast pension fund. Billions of dollars, meant for retirement and medical care, were siphoned off into mob-controlled loans and construction projects. Casinos in Las Vegas, hotels in Miami, skyscrapers in Manhattan, built not just with union labor, but with union money. The Teamsters' Central States Pension Fund became a private bank for organized crime. Loans were given with no collateral, no questions. Money flowed into mob ventures, often never to return, and Hoffa, fiercely loyal to those who backed him, turned a blind eye, or perhaps saw too much and said too little. But the reach of the commission didn't stop at the Teamsters. In New York, the Mafia infiltrated the International Longshore Association, the union that controlled the docks. This gave them control over shipping routes, cargo manifests, and waterfront labor. It allowed them to extort shipping companies, hijack valuable goods, and smuggle drugs and weapons through ports without detection. If something came in or out of New York Harbor, the Mafia knew about it and likely profited from it. They also wormed their way into the Laborers' International Union of North America, the Carpenters' Union, the Cement and Concrete Workers' Union, and countless others. On construction sites, no shovel hit dirt without the mob's say-so. Contracts were awarded based on payoffs, not bids. Delays were manufactured to inflate costs. Union officials became bagmen, collecting tribute from companies desperate to avoid strikes or violence. This control wasn't exercised with brute force alone. It was embedded in the very fabric of the system. The Mafia placed trusted associates in union leadership roles. They fixed elections, manipulated bylaws, and ensured that every grievance, every contract, every picket line served their interest. Union halls became command centers. Union meetings were stages for performance and deception, and the working men, often unaware or unwilling to resist, became pawns in a game far larger than they could see. The profits were staggering. By inflating construction costs, skimming from pension funds, and extorting businesses for labor peace, the Mafia created a revenue stream that dwarfed many of their traditional rackets. And unlike drug trafficking or armed robbery, this income looked clean on the surface. It came through bank accounts, not back alleys, but behind the scenes. The violence never stopped. Contractors who refused to pay faced broken bones or worse. Union leaders who stepped out of line disappeared. Whistleblowers were silenced. Strikes were used as weapons, labor stoppages as extortion tactics. The mob didn't just sit at the bargaining table, they owned it. They rewrote the rules of negotiation with threats inked in blood. Federal authorities knew what was happening, but proving it was another matter. The lines between legitimate labor activity and organized crime were blurred. Witnesses were hard to find. Records were forged or destroyed, and when investigators came close, union lawyers often bought and paid for slowed them down. It was a maze, and the commission had drawn the map. Still, pressure mounted. By the late 1950s and into the 60s, congressional hearings began shining light on the mafia's grip on labor. The McClellan Committee, led by Senator John McClellan and aided by a young attorney named Robert F. Kennedy, turned the issue into a national scandal. Hoffa was subpoenaed. Union officials were grilled on live television. For the first time, the American public saw what had long been whispered behind closed doors, that their unions were being run not just by bosses, but by crime bosses. Hoffa fought back with fury. He denied mob ties, attacked the government, and used his popularity with the rank-and-file to maintain power. But in 1967, he was finally convicted on charges of jury tampering and fraud. He was sent to prison. And while he hoped to return, he never did. In 1975, Jimmy Hoffa vanished. He was last seen outside a Detroit restaurant, supposedly meeting with two Mafia associates. His body was never found. Theories abound: buried under a stadium, dissolved in acid, dumped in a swamp. But the truth remains buried with him. What's clear is this: Hoffa's usefulness had expired, and in the world of the commission, that meant only one thing. Even after Hoffa's disappearance, the Mafia's control over labor didn't vanish overnight. They simply adapted. New leaders took old positions. Union influence remained a valuable commodity, one worth protecting, manipulating, and monetizing. The FBI, using RICO statutes, would eventually crack many of these networks. Convictions would follow. But for decades, the damage had already been done. The irony is painful. Unions were born to protect the working man, to shield him from exploitation and abuse. But in the hands of the Mafia, they became another tool of oppression. Workers marched for better wages, only to have their pensions stolen. They fought for safety, only to be threatened by those claiming to represent them. The Mafia didn't just steal money, they stole trust. And yet, they did it with such subtlety, such precision, that the system rarely buckled. It bent, but it did not break. That was the brilliance of the Commission's design: to hide in plain sight, to use the rules against themselves, to turn labor once a weapon of the people, linked to a kingdom ruled from the shadows. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about ideology. It was about power. Pure, unfiltered power. The ability to control a city's skyline, a port's lifeblood, a nation's distribution chain. The Mafia didn't just infiltrate unions, they became unions. And for a time, they were the silent hand shaping America's economy from the ground up. This was no side racket. This was central to their empire. And as long as there were contracts to sign, workers to move, and money to skim, the Commission ensured the gears of labor kept turning, greased, not by sweat alone, but by fear. Infiltrating unions wasn't just profitable, it was genius. A long con with real muscle. A system where the lines between right and wrong, legal and illegal, blurred until they vanished completely. The Mafia didn't just seize power, they institutionalized it. And the unions, meant to be the voice of the voiceless, became one more instrument in their orchestra of control. Chapter 10: Political Protection, Corruption in High Places. For the Commission to wield power over America's underworld, it needed more than muscle, money, and secrecy. It needed shields, barriers that could block investigation, hinder prosecution, and erase inconvenient evidence. Those shields were not forged in gunfire or bribes alone. They were crafted in quiet rooms, in polished offices, and across mahogany tables, where whispered deals secured the complicity of some of the most powerful figures in local government, law enforcement, and the judiciary. This was the Mafia's secret weapon: political protection. Corruption was never a peripheral strategy for the Commission. It was central to its survival. From the dawn of organized crime in America, the syndicate understood that raw violence would only carry it so far. To maintain an empire, it had to infiltrate the very institutions designed to dismantle it. Judges who could throw cases, police who could turn blind eyes, politicians who could rewrite laws or ensure they were never enforced. This was the unholy alliance that turned crime into an untouchable enterprise. The roots of this corruption ran deep. In many cities, especially in New York, Chicago, and Detroit, political machines thrived on patronage and favors. These machines were often intertwined with immigrant communities, the same communities that the Mafia emerged from and exploited. The mob's leaders had long learned to speak the language of these political bosses, offering votes, cash, and muscle in exchange for influence and immunity. One of the earliest and most infamous examples was in New York City, where Tammany Hall ruled politics for generations. While not directly controlled by the Mafia, Tammany's bosses understood that crime and politics were intertwined. Mob figures could deliver votes in key precincts, intimidate rivals, and provide campaign funding. In return, elected officials ensured police departments were well managed to avoid interference with rackets, and prosecutors hesitated to pursue cases that could upset this delicate balance. The relationship was symbiotic, built on mutual benefit and mutual dependency. Politicians received the support they needed to stay in office. The Mafia gained the protection to operate without fear of law enforcement. Public safety was compromised, but the status quo remained intact. Law enforcement itself was one of the Mafia's greatest assets. Police officers, especially at the local level, were often paid off, threatened, or recruited. They would tip off mobsters about upcoming raids, suppress evidence, or ignore suspicious activity altogether. Some officers rose through the ranks by pleasing the mob, trading enforcement for loyalty. Corruption wasn't limited to patrol officers. It extended into specialized units tasked with investigating organized crime. These units were sometimes sabotaged from within, turning what should have been weapons into shields. The FBI, in its early years, struggled to penetrate this web. Bureau agents faced hostile local officials and uncooperative witnesses. Informants were rare and dangerous to recruit. In many cases, the very police departments that were supposed to uphold the law hindered investigations. The Mafia's influence was a cancer that spread silently through the fabric of law enforcement. The judiciary was another critical pillar. Judges presided over trials with the power to shape outcomes. Through bribery, intimidation, or ideological sympathy, many judges became part of the Mafia's extended family. They could dismiss cases, reduce sentences, or grant bail to dangerous criminals. Their decisions sent clear messages: cross the Mafia at your peril. But the law might not be your ally. Political corruption was often cloaked in plausible deniability. Campaign contributions came through intermediaries, favored contractors, and city jobs were awarded without scrutiny. Public officials engaged in a dance of deception, publicly condemning crime, privately negotiating with its leaders. This duplicity blurred the lines between governance and crime, creating a shadow state that operated alongside, and often within, legitimate power structures. The Mafia's ability to penetrate government was aided by its discipline and secrecy. Members understood the risks of exposure. They used frontmen, shell companies, and intermediaries to launder money and influence decisions. No one who worked with the Commission did so openly. The network was labyrinthine, with connections layered in complexity to protect the core leadership. Perhaps no political figure embodied this nexus better than Frank the Irishman Sheeran, whose story would later inspire both fear and fascination. As a labor union official with deep mafia ties, Sheeran navigated worlds that overlapped with politicians, mobsters, and law enforcement. His story illustrated how corruption was not isolated, but woven into the very institutions that governed daily life. The consequences of this protection were profound. Major investigations were stalled or derailed. Witnesses disappeared or recanted. Convictions were rare and often overturned on technicalities. The Commission's empire flourished in the gaps of enforcement, growing bolder as it knew the walls were porous. The public, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the depths of corruption, trusting that justice would prevail in cities across America. The Mafia's political influence shaped policy and power. Zoning laws were manipulated to benefit mob-controlled construction firms. Licensing boards turned a blind eye to illegal gambling operations. Police budgets were adjusted to prioritize other threats, while organized crime was left unchecked. It was a governance by shadow, silent, efficient, and deadly. Federal law enforcement began to respond with greater intensity in the mid-20th century. The introduction of wiretapping, undercover operations, and financial investigations slowly peeled back the layers. High-profile cases, such as the Kefauver hearings and later, the Valachi revelations, exposed the tangled web of corruption. Still, for every official brought down, many more remained complicit or silent. This silent partnership also extended beyond local levels. In some cases, the Mafia reached into state politics and even federal offices. Corrupt politicians wielded influence over legislation, appointments, and law enforcement priorities. Campaigns were funded with mob money. Policies were shaped by unseen hands. This reach gave the Commission a degree of insulation from prosecution that few criminal enterprises enjoyed. The most chilling aspect of this political protection was its invisibility. The average citizen saw the police, the courts, the politicians' symbols of order and justice. Few understood the silent deals, the bribes slipped under tables, the favors exchanged in backrooms. The Mafia's political protection was the ultimate paradox, the crime that thrived by corrupting those sworn to stop it. The fragile alliance between crime and politics eventually began to fracture as law enforcement grew more sophisticated. New investigative tools, stronger federal statutes, and relentless prosecutors chipped away at the Mafia's defenses. Yet, corruption did not vanish overnight. It lingered, shifting, adapting to new realities. By the late 20th century, a series of high-profile convictions of judges, police officers, and politicians shocked the nation. The veil of secrecy lifted, exposing how deeply the Commission had entwined itself in the machinery of governance. The cost had been high, public trust eroded, justice delayed, and crime emboldened. But the story of political protection is not just one of corruption. It is a cautionary tale about power, how it can be wielded, abused, and protected. It reveals how fragile institutions can become when they are co-opted by those who seek to undermine them, and it underscores the resilience of the human spirit in confronting these shadows. Today, efforts to combat corruption continue, informed by the lessons of the Commission's reign. Transparency, accountability, and vigilant enforcement are the bulwarks against the dark bargains of the past. Yet, the history remains a stark reminder. When crime finds partners in high places, the rule of law is at risk. The Commission's quiet partnership with officials was not just a survival tactic, it was the foundation of its empire. Through corruption in high places, organized crime didn't just exist alongside the state, it became part of it. A shadow government, operating in plain sight, its true power hidden behind the facade of democracy and justice. Chapter 11. The Apalachin Meeting, exposed to the world in the cool shadows of the Catskill Mountains. On a humid November night in 1957, a quiet, unassuming house in Apalachin, New York, became the epicenter of a seismic event that would forever alter the landscape of American law enforcement. For decades, the Mafia had operated in the shadows, whispers in smoky back rooms, rumors dismissed as folklore, an invisible hand guiding the underworld. But on this night, the world would finally glimpse the true scale of the Commission's power, and the FBI would be forced to acknowledge what it had long denied: organized crime existed, and it was national. The gathering was meant to be a secret Semita meeting of the most powerful Mafia bosses from across the United States. The location was carefully chosen for its isolation, a large, secluded estate owned by Joseph Barbara, a reputed mobster with ties stretching from New York to Pennsylvania. The agenda was said to cover a wide range of issues: territorial disputes, narcotics trafficking, gambling operations, and the delicate balance of power within the Commission itself. It was the Mafia's own boardroom, convening to keep order among chaos. But the secrecy was shattered by something as mundane as a highway patrolman. Sergeant Edgar D. Croswell, a veteran officer from the nearby town of Waverly, had been keeping tabs on Barbara for months, suspicious of strange activity and unusual visitors. Luxury cars parked along the rural roads, men in tailored suits arriving in the dead of night. Croswell decided to investigate. What began as routine surveillance soon uncovered a web of connections too large to ignore. On November 14, 1957, as dozens of men converged on the Barbara estate, law enforcement moved in. Officers from multiple jurisdictions, including state police and local deputies, set up roadblocks and checkpoints on all the major routes leading away from the property. The stage was set for an unprecedented sting operation. Inside the attendees, some estimates say over 100 men were caught off guard. Panic rippled through the gathering as word spread of the approaching police. Many scrambled to escape through the woods, scaling fences and disappearing into the night. But despite their efforts, the net closed tightly. 43 men were apprehended that night, a veritable who's who of organized crime. Carlo Gambino, Zito Genovese, Joseph Bonanno, and dozens more, representing families from New York, Chicago, Detroit, and beyond. The arrests sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the public alike. For the first time, there was irrefutable proof of a coordinated, nationwide criminal syndicate. The media seized on the story, painting dramatic portraits of shadowy figures in suits fleeing into the darkness. Headlines proclaimed the Mafia's reach and ruthlessness. The myth had become reality. For years prior, the FBI, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, had downplayed or outright denied the existence of a national crime syndicate. Hoover's reluctance stemmed from political pressures, skepticism, and a preference to focus on communism and organized labor as threats. The Apalachin Meeting shattered this narrative. The agency was forced to shift gears, to expand investigations, and to dedicate resources to dismantling the Commission. The fallout was immediate and intense. The men arrested faced charges ranging from conspiracy to obstruction of justice. Though many cases ultimately faltered due to witness intimidation and legal maneuvering, the meeting marked a turning point. Law enforcement began to appreciate the scale and sophistication of the Mafia's operations, recognizing that they were dealing with an enterprise, not isolated gangs. The public reaction was equally profound. Suddenly, the Mafia was no longer a distant legend confined to movies or sensational journalism. It was real, pervasive, and dangerous. Americans across the country were confronted with the unsettling reality that their cities and towns were under the shadow of a criminal empire. The Apalachin Meeting also exposed fractures within the Mafia itself. The panic and the arrests sowed seeds of distrust. Some families blamed others for the security breach. Rumors swirled of informants and betrayals. The cohesion of the commission was tested, forcing its leaders to reconsider how they operated. In the aftermath, the commission tightened its security protocols. Future meetings were more secretive, smaller, and more carefully guarded. The organization adapted, learning from the mistake that nearly brought it down. Yet, despite these setbacks, the Commission's power did not wane. If anything, it became more calculated, more insidious. For the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, Apalachin was the beginning of a new chapter. The event galvanized federal efforts, leading to expanded surveillance, increased wiretapping, and the use of informants. Within the Mafia's ranks, it set the stage for decades of investigation and prosecution that would culminate in landmark cases and the eventual weakening of the Commission's grip. The story of the Apalachin Meeting is not just about a failed summit or a police raid. It is about the moment when the veil was lifted, when the nation was forced to confront the reality of organized crime in its midst. It is about the collision of myth and fact, power and vulnerability, silence and exposure. That night in Apalachin, the Mafia's secret world was thrown into the harsh light of day. And from that moment forward, there was no turning back. Chapter 12, Omertà. The code that built the empire in the shadowy underworld, ruled by the Commission. There existed a law more powerful than any statute written by governments, more binding than any oath sworn on a Bible. This was the unyielding code of silence that formed the backbone of the Mafia's existence. It was a covenant forged not merely in fear, but in loyalty, honor, and a brutal understanding that survival depended on secrecy. Omertà is a word whispered in darkened rooms, carried through generations of Sicilian families, and etched into the very identity of the American Mafia. It was more than silence. It was an ethic, a moral framework, and a tool of control. To break Omertà was to betray one's family, one's history, and ultimately, oneself. It was the unspoken rule that kept the machine running, the machinery of crime grinding smoothly beneath the surface of society. The origins of Omertà lie deep in Sicily, in a landscape scarred by centuries of foreign invasion, poverty, and lawlessness. In a land where justice was often a matter of personal vengeance, the people developed their own code, a code that demanded absolute discretion, unshakable loyalty, and an unbreakable silence to protect the group against outside threats. It was a defense mechanism, a survival instinct in a world where authority was weak and treachery deadly. When Sicilian immigrants arrived in America, they brought Omertà with them. It became the cornerstone of the Mafia's adaptation in a new world, a shield against the scrutiny of the law, the media, and the public. The code was taught early: loyalty above all else, family before self, silence as the highest form of respect. To speak to outsiders was to invite death. To cooperate with law enforcement was the ultimate sin. Omertà's power lay not just in fear of punishment, but in the cultural and psychological bonds it created. It transformed criminal activity into a collective enterprise, a shared destiny where individual interests were subordinate to the family's survival. It fostered trust in a world of betrayal, instilling discipline and order where chaos could easily reign. The consequences of breaking Omertà were swift and merciless. Informants, or rats as they were known, faced brutal retribution. Disappearances, murders, and public executions served as grim warnings. The Mafia's enforcement arm, Murder Inc., was famously charged with maintaining this code through lethal means. Silence was a currency more valuable than gold, and those who failed to uphold it paid the highest price. Yet, Omertà was not merely a code of silence about crimes. It was also a broader social contract. It demanded respect for the family hierarchy, adherence to tradition, and an unwavering loyalty that transcended personal grievances. Members were expected to sacrifice for the collective, endure hardship without complaint, and uphold the Mafia's honor above all. This loyalty extended beyond blood relations. The commission itself was a testament to the power of rival families setting aside differences to preserve the empire's stability. Bound by a shared code of conduct and mutual enforcement, betrayals were rare because the cost was so high, and trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to restore. However, Omertà was never perfect. Over time, cracks appeared in the facade. The pressures of law enforcement, the lure of plea bargains, and the fear of long prison sentences tempted some to break the silence. High-profile informants, like Joseph Valachi in the 1960s, shattered the code's mystique, revealing the inner workings of the commission to the world. Yet, even these defections were met with contempt and violence from the mob. Omertà's influence was also felt beyond the Mafia's core. It affected witnesses, victims, and entire communities. Fear of retaliation silenced many who might have testified or resisted. The code extended its reach into neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces, creating an environment where silence was the safest option. This perpetuated the Mafia's power by isolating it from law enforcement and public scrutiny. The psychological weight of Omertà was immense. Members lived in constant vigilance, guarding their words, their actions, and their families. Trust was rare and precious. Betrayal unforgivable. The code demanded that loyalty be proven repeatedly through silence, obedience, and sacrifice. It shaped identities, forging men into devoted soldiers of the commission in many ways. Omertà was the Mafia's greatest weapon. It rendered law enforcement's most powerful tool, testimony, ineffective. It turned trials into battles of suspicion and hearsay, where witnesses were intimidated into silence or disappeared entirely. It allowed the commission to operate with impunity, knowing that the wall of silence protected them. Yet, this code of silence was also a double-edged sword. Its rigidity bred paranoia, distrust, and isolation within the Mafia itself. Members lived under constant threat of suspicion. Friendships could sour. Alliances could fracture. The pressure to remain loyal often clashed with personal survival instincts, creating internal tensions that sometimes led to violence and betrayal. The decline of Omertà's effectiveness began in the late 20th century. Law enforcement evolved, employing undercover agents, wiretaps, and the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations Act RICO to break through the silence. Witness protection programs offered a lifeline to those willing to speak. Slowly, the code's grip weakened as more insiders chose cooperation over loyalty. Despite these challenges, Omertà's legacy remains profound. It shaped the culture, structure, and operations of the Commission for decades. It defined the Mafia's identity as much as its criminal enterprises. Understanding Omertà is essential to understanding how the Commission built and maintained its empire through fear. Yes, but also through a complex web of loyalty, family, and unyielding silence. The Code of Omertà was more than a rule. It was a way of life. It forged a brotherhood bound not just by crime, but by trust and tradition. It was the invisible force that held the empire together until the cracks grew too large, and silence could no longer protect the truth. Chapter 13: Rackets and Territories, Crime. Coast to coast, from the bustling streets of New York to the sun-drenched shores of California, from the sprawling ports of Chicago to the glittering resorts of Florida, the Commission's reach was vast and unrelenting. It was not merely a New York phenomenon. It was a national enterprise, a sprawling network of criminal operations carefully divided by territories, managed with ruthless precision and fueled by a diversity of rackets that sustained an empire. At the heart of the Commission's power was control over people, markets, and territories. The syndicate understood that to maximize profit and minimize conflict, each family or faction needed clearly defined areas of influence. These were sacred boundaries, respected and enforced with brutal efficiency. Trespassers were met not just with resistance, but often with deadly consequences. In Chicago, the legacy of Al Capone was still palpable decades after his reign ended. The Chicago outfit, led by figures like Tony Accardo and later Sam Giancana, operated with a sophistication that rivaled New York's families. Their territories extended beyond the city's limits into suburban and rural Illinois, controlling gambling, loan sharking, and labor rackets. Chicago's strategic location as a transportation hub made it a vital node for smuggling narcotics and contraband into the Midwest. The outfit's influence extended into the nation's heartland, where their control over unions and businesses created a shadow economy operating beneath legitimate commerce. Casinos in nearby Lake County became hotbeds for illegal gambling, while the ports of Chicago facilitated the smuggling of goods, both legal and illicit. The Chicago mob's ties to politicians and law enforcement ensured their operations faced little interference, mirroring the model established by the Commission on the East Coast. Further south, Florida emerged as a critical asset in the Commission's portfolio. Its sunny climate and booming tourism industry provided cover for an array of illicit activities. The Mafia's presence in Miami, Tampa, and Jacksonville became synonymous with drug trafficking, money laundering, and the operation of illegal gambling dens. The city's proximity to the Caribbean made it a natural gateway for narcotics entering the United States, with the mob playing a key role in controlling these smuggling routes. Florida also became a favored retirement haven and investment playground for mafia figures. Luxury hotels, restaurants, and real estate ventures offered both a means of laundering money and a way to maintain influence in a rapidly changing economic landscape. These ventures were not mere sidelines, but integral parts of the criminal enterprise, blending legitimate business with illicit profits. On the West Coast, California's burgeoning cities presented both opportunities and challenges. The Commission's influence was less centralized here, yet the syndicate established powerful footholds in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and the Bay Area. These families controlled illegal gambling, narcotics distribution, and extortion rackets, often working alongside local gangs and other criminal organizations. The West Coast operations were notable for their diversity and adaptability. The Mafia's involvement in the entertainment industry, particularly in Hollywood, provided not only profits but cultural influence. Control over labor unions in film production and distribution allowed the mob to exert pressure and extract payments under the guise of legitimate business dealings. The glitz and glamour of California masked a darker, hidden reality beneath. Nationwide, narcotics trafficking was one of the Commission's most lucrative rackets. From heroin smuggled through New York's ports to cocaine funneled through Miami and Los Angeles, the syndicate managed a vast and complex distribution network. Partnerships with international suppliers, often tied to the Sicilian Mafia or other criminal organizations abroad, ensured a steady flow of product into the American market. The narcotics trade was both a source of enormous wealth and a source of internal conflict. Some families embraced the trade wholeheartedly, while others viewed it as too risky or morally compromising. This led to tensions within the Commission, but the potential profits often outweighed these concerns. Control over the drug trade translated into influence and power far beyond traditional rackets. Illegal gambling, meanwhile, remained a cornerstone of the Commission's revenue. From small numbers games run in urban neighborhoods to elaborate casinos in Las Vegas and beyond, the syndicate controlled the odds and the money. Gambling operations were tightly managed, with careful oversight to prevent cheating, ensure loyalty, and maximize profits. Loan sharking, another staple racket, preyed on those unable to secure credit through legal means, with exorbitant interest rates and brutal enforcement of repayment. Loan sharking generated steady cash flow while fostering a climate of fear. Victims were often trapped in cycles of debt and violence, their fates controlled by the mob's enforcers. Extortion and protection. Rackets extended into virtually every sector of American business, from small shops to large corporations. Businesses paid for protection from the very violence that the Commission threatened. Failure to comply invited sabotage, arson, or worse. This created an ecosystem of control, where the Mafia was both a threat and a protector, ensuring compliance through fear wrapped in a veneer of order. Territorial disputes were carefully managed through the Commission's system of governance. Conflicts that might have erupted into open warfare were settled through negotiation, arbitration, or sanctioned hits. This avoided the kind of public violence that drew unwanted attention, preserving the Mafia's secrecy and longevity. The syndicate's ability to maintain a delicate balance of power was a testament to its sophistication. The reach of the Commission extended beyond cities and states. It penetrated rural areas, controlling illicit operations in seemingly quiet communities, moonshining in the Appalachians, narcotics in border towns, and gambling in remote locations all contributed to the syndicate's bottom line. Each territory was a piece in the vast puzzle of national crime. This sprawling network required coordination and oversight. The Commission's leaders convened regularly to manage disputes, allocate territories, and share intelligence. Communication was constant, and breaches of protocol were met with swift retribution. The syndicate's success rested on its ability to operate like a corporation, with clear hierarchies, roles, and responsibilities. Yet, despite its order and discipline, the Commission's empire was not invincible. Law enforcement efforts across the country sought to dismantle its operations. The FBI, and local police employed infiltration, surveillance, and prosecution to strike at the syndicate's core. High-profile arrests and trials disrupted networks, but often only temporarily. The Mafia's adaptability and resilience proved formidable. The syndicate's national footprint shaped the criminal underworld in ways that echoed beyond their immediate control. It influenced drug markets, labor relations, political corruption, and economic development. The impact was felt in boardrooms and back alleys alike, illustrating the far-reaching consequences of organized crime's presence. Ultimately, the Commission's ability to manage rackets and territories coast to coast defined its legacy. It transformed disparate criminal groups into a unified, efficient enterprise capable of wielding influence across the nation. The empire was not built on brute force alone, but on strategy, negotiation, and ruthless business acumen. This chapter of America's criminal history is a testament to the complexity and scale of organized crime. It reveals an underworld that was deeply embedded in the fabric of society, shaping economies, corrupting institutions, and challenging the rule of law. The Commission was not just a collection of criminals. It was a national force, a dark empire, spanning from coast to coast, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's history. Chapter 14: Internal Wars and Blood Feuds. Within the seemingly unbreakable facade of the Commission's empire, the true reality was far more fragile, volatile, and often violent. Beneath the polished veneer of order and cooperation lurked deep-seated rivalries, grudges, and ambitions that frequently erupted into brutal internal wars and bitter blood feuds. These conflicts shaped the Mafia's history as much as its external battles, revealing a world where loyalty could be shattered, alliances broken, and betrayal paid in blood. The Bonanno family, one of the original 5 families of New York, became synonymous with internal strife during the infamous Bonanno coup of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Joseph Bonanno, the family's patriarch, had long ruled with a firm yet traditional hand, but his desire to consolidate power and challenge the Commission's authority set the stage for catastrophe. Bonanno's attempt to orchestrate a coup against the Commission was a gamble born of arrogance and desperation. He sought to eliminate rivals and assert dominance, believing his family's legacy entitled him to a greater role. This move was a direct affront to the fragile balance the Commission had painstakingly maintained. The result was a violent backlash. The internal war that followed splintered the Bonanno family. Factions loyal to Bonanno clashed with those aligned with the Commission's interests, plunging the family into a civil war marked by shootings, kidnappings, and assassinations. The chaos exposed the cracks in the Mafia's code of silence as some members defected or turned informant to survive. The Bonanno coup was a stark lesson in the consequences of ambition unchecked by consensus. Meanwhile, the Colombo family experienced its own devastating internal conflict during the Colombo Wars, a series of violent battles spanning from the late 1960s into the early 1980s. Triggered by power struggles within the family, the wars saw factions vying for control, using brutality and terror to settle scores. The infamous shooting of boss Joseph Colombo in 1971, Naney's assassination attempt that left him paralyzed, was emblematic of the chaos. The Colombo Wars decimated the family's leadership and destabilized their operations. As rival factions fought for supremacy, innocent bystanders became collateral damage. The public violence drew intense law enforcement scrutiny, forcing the family further underground and weakening its influence. Yet, even amidst this turmoil, the Mafia's core structures endured, adapting to survive. These internal wars were not unique to the Bonanno or Colombo families. Across the Mafia landscape, feuds erupted over territorial disputes, personal betrayals, and perceived slights. Trust was fragile, and suspicion constant. The Commission itself was sometimes forced to intervene, mediating disputes or sanctioning hits to restore order. However, such interventions often only postponed further bloodshed. The human cost of these conflicts was profound. Brothers turned against brothers. Lifelong friendships dissolved in violence. Families lived in fear, caught between loyalty and survival. The code of Omertà frayed as desperation drove some to cooperate with law enforcement to protect themselves. The Mafia's image of unity was often a mask for brutal internal discord. Notably, the failure to maintain unity during these wars weakened the Commission's overall power. Law enforcement exploited these divisions, using informants and defectors to dismantle operations. The very secrecy that once protected the Mafia became a vulnerability when trust eroded. Internal wars hastened the decline of several families, illustrating the dangers of unchecked ambition and greed. Yet, in the aftermath of conflict, the Mafia often demonstrated remarkable resilience. New leaders emerged from the ashes of war, sometimes more ruthless, sometimes more cunning. Families rebuilt their strength, negotiated new alliances, and resumed their operations. The cycle of violence and reconstruction was a grim testament to the underworld's persistence. The blood feuds of this era also underscored the fragile balance between order and chaos within the Commission's empire. While external conflicts threatened the Mafia's existence, it was internal strife that often brought it to the brink. The delicate equilibrium between cooperation and competition was constantly tested by the ambitions and egos of those who sought power. These wars also exposed the limits of the Commission's authority. Though it was conceived as a governing body to prevent such conflicts, it could not always control the passions and vendettas of its members. The Commission's ability to enforce peace was often contingent on the willingness of families to adhere to its rules, and when that broke down, violence ensued. Ultimately, the internal wars and blood feuds were defining chapters in the history of America's organized crime. They revealed a complex tapestry of power, loyalty, and betrayal, where the pursuit of dominance frequently came at a devastating cost. These conflicts shaped the Mafia's evolution, influencing its strategies, structures, and survival tactics. The story of these feuds is a story of human frailty and ambition set against the backdrop of a shadow empire. It is a reminder that even in the darkest corners of power, trust is fragile, and peace is often temporary. The Commission's rule was not merely forged through discipline and strategy, but was constantly threatened by the very men who lived by its codes and sometimes died because of them. Chapter 15. The Commission Trials, Breaking the Silence. The mid-1980s marked a watershed moment in the battle between law enforcement and the Mafia's most powerful leaders. For decades, the Commission had ruled America's underworld, with near impunity its members shrouded in secrecy, shielded by a code of silence that seemed unbreakable. But in 1985 and 1986, under the relentless pursuit of United States Attorney Rudy Giuliani and a team of dedicated prosecutors, that silence began to crack, ushering in an era that would shake the Commission to its core. The tool that made this seismic shift possible was the racketeer. Influenced and corrupt organizations, act better known simply as RICO, passed in 1970. This federal statute gave prosecutors unprecedented power to charge entire criminal organizations with racketeering activity, rather than just individual crimes. It was a legal weapon designed to cut through the layers of insulation that protected Mafia families, targeting not just acts of violence, but the very enterprise that orchestrated them. Giuliani, a fiery and ambitious prosecutor, recognized the potential of RICO to dismantle the Mafia's command structure. He understood that hitting the foot soldiers was futile without taking down the bosses who orchestrated the empire from behind the scenes. The Commission, the secret council of crime families that governed disputes, sanctioned hits, and divided territories, was the true prize. Giuliani aimed to expose and prosecute the leadership that had operated above the law for so long. The investigation was sprawling and complex. It involved wiretaps, surveillance, informants, and painstaking analysis of financial records. For years, federal agents painstakingly built a case, weaving together the threads of conspiracy, extortion, murder, and corruption into a coherent narrative. They identified key players across the 5 families: the Lucchese, Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo, documenting how they operated as a criminal cartel. The trial itself was unprecedented. The courtroom became a battleground where decades of Mafia secrecy were laid bare. Witnesses who once would have been unthinkable to testify for more mobsters, associates, and insiders came forward, breaking the sacred code of Omertà. Their testimonies revealed the inner workings of the Commission: secret meetings, decisions to authorize hits, coordinated criminal activities that spanned the nation. The prosecution's case was meticulous, painting a vivid picture of a vast criminal enterprise that controlled illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor rackets, and narcotics trafficking. It exposed how the Commission enforced its rule with brutal efficiency, eliminating rivals, intimidating witnesses, and corrupting public officials to maintain their grip on power. The defendants, many of whom were legendary figures in organized crime, faced overwhelming evidence. The trial put them under intense scrutiny, eroding their aura of invincibility. The courtroom drama was gripping, a clash of wills between prosecutors determined to end the Mafia's reign and defendants who relied on fear, intimidation, and silence to defend themselves. As the trial progressed, the public watched closely. The media coverage brought the hidden world of organized crime into the spotlight, revealing the human faces behind the myth. Families of defendants, law enforcement officials, and victims all played roles in this unfolding drama, highlighting the complex human cost of the Commission's empire. The verdicts delivered resounding blows to the Mafia's leadership. Several high-ranking bosses were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Commission itself, once an untouchable shadow government of crime, was publicly dismantled in the eyes of the law. The trials demonstrated that the rule of law could penetrate even the darkest corners of the underworld. However, the victory was not absolute. The Mafia adapted, restructured, and found new ways to operate. The power vacuum created by the convictions led to new struggles for dominance, shifting alliances, and, at times, renewed violence. The trials had fractured the empire but had not completely destroyed it. Nevertheless, the Commission trials marked a turning point. They empowered law enforcement agencies nationwide to pursue organized crime more aggressively. They encouraged other potential informants and defectors to come forward, further eroding the code of silence. The legal precedents set by these cases reshaped how organized crime was prosecuted for decades to come. The impact extended beyond the courtroom. Politically, the trials bolstered Rudy Giuliani's reputation, launching him into the national spotlight and eventually into the mayoralty of New York City. The public gained a new awareness of the Mafia's reach and influence, fueling demands for continued vigilance and reform. For the Commission, the trials were a profound humiliation and a serious threat. The empire that had ruled the shadows with near immunity now faced exposure and legal assault. Its leaders were behind bars, its secrets revealed, and its cohesion disrupted. The trials had punctured the veil of invincibility that the Commission had long enjoyed. Yet, in true Mafia fashion, the story was not simply one of defeat. The underworld endured, adapting to new realities. The Commission, while weakened, did not vanish. Its legacy of power, fear, and control persisted, evolving with the times. The trials were a chapter, not the final act, in the grand narrative of America's organized crime. The Commission trials stand as a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice against a formidable adversary. They are a story of courage, strategy, and the breaking of silence that had long protected the underworld's darkest secrets. Through these trials, the curtain was pulled back, revealing the complex and often brutal machinery of the Commission's empire. This chapter in the saga serves as a reminder: no empire, no matter how secretive or powerful, is beyond the reach of the law. And when silence breaks, the truth has the power to dismantle even the most entrenched criminal dominions. Chapter 16: Rats and Wiretaps. The informant era begins. For decades, the Commission had thrived in the shadows, its operations cloaked in secrecy, protected by a code so rigid that breaking it was tantamount to a death sentence. Omertà, the Mafia's code of silence, had been their greatest shield, enabling generations of mobsters to conduct illicit business with impunity. But the mid to late 20th century ushered in an era that would unravel this veil of secrecy, an era defined by rats, wiretaps, and relentless surveillance. The beginnings of this seismic shift can be traced back to the 1960s, with Joseph Valaci, a low-ranking soldier in the Genovese family who dared to break the code. In 1963, Valaci became the first Mafia insider to publicly acknowledge the existence of La Cosa Nostra. His testimony before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations stunned the nation and law enforcement alike. For the first time, the inner workings of the Commission, the secret meetings, the hierarchy, the rituals were laid bare in chilling detail. Valaci's revelations were monumental. He described the brutal enforcement methods, the initiation ceremonies, the structure of the families, and the omnipresent fear that sustained their operations. His testimony pierced the Mafia's impenetrable facade, signaling the beginning of cracks that would widen in the decades to come. The myth of the untouchable crime family was shattered, and with it, the aura of invincibility that had long protected the Commission. Meanwhile, the FBI, long criticized for underestimating organized crime, began to embrace new tactics. Under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover's successors, federal agents expanded the use of technology, most notably wiretaps. These devices, hidden in social clubs, restaurants, and private homes, captured candid conversations among mobsters, exposing their plans and operations with unfiltered clarity. Social clubs, once seen as the heart of Mafia social life and secrecy, their own undoing. These venues, where mobsters gathered to discuss business and indulge in camaraderie, were increasingly infiltrated by law enforcement. Wiretaps recorded everything: discussions of hits, money laundering, territorial disputes, and conspiracies to intimidate or eliminate rivals. These recordings provided prosecutors with compelling evidence, often corroborated by informants, to dismantle Mafia networks. The FBI's success with surveillance was not merely technological but also strategic. They cultivated informantsmen embedded within the families, willing to betray the oath for various reasons: self-preservation, greed, or vengeance. These turncoats became invaluable assets, guiding law enforcement through the labyrinthine structures of the Mafia. One of the most notorious informants was Salvatore Sammy, the Bull Gravano underboss of the Gambino family. Gravano's defection in the early 1990s marked a turning point in the war against the Commission. His insider knowledge was unparalleled, implicating dozens of mobsters in murders, racketeering, and extortion. His testimony helped convict John Gotti, the infamous Gambino boss, stripping away the final layers of protection around Mafia leadership. Gravano's decision to cooperate was emblematic of a broader erosion of loyalty within the Mafia ranks. Increasingly, the risks of silence outweighed the benefits. Long prison sentences, coupled with the Federal Witness Protection Program, enticed more members to turn state's evidence. The Code of Omertà, once ironclad, began to unravel under the weight of legal pressure and personal survival. The informant era also introduced a new dimension of psychological warfare within the Commission. Paranoia spread among members as trust became scarce. Suspicion of infiltration and betrayal fractured families, making coordination difficult. The very secrecy that had safeguarded the organization became a source of vulnerability, forcing the Commission to operate with heightened caution and, at times, suspicion even toward its own. This period also saw landmark legal cases built on wiretap evidence and informant testimony. Courts were flooded with tapes capturing mobsters, discussing crimes in their own words, a powerful tool against the traditional Mafia defense of denial and disinformation. Trials became showcases of the government's ability to expose the Mafia's inner workings, turning their own words into weapons. The impact of this surveillance and informant infiltration was profound. Entire operations were dismantled, and families once thought invincible found themselves crippled. The Commission's ability to govern the National Crime Syndicate was severely undermined. Rival factions exploited the chaos, while law enforcement capitalized on the newfound access to information. Yet, despite the damage, the Commission did not disappear. It adapted, learning to communicate with greater discretion, tightening security, and evolving its methods. The use of coded language, meetings in remote locations, and compartmentalization of information became standard practices. Still, the era of absolute secrecy was over. The informant era reshaped the public's perception of the Mafia. The romanticized image of the honor-bound gangster was replaced with the stark reality of a fractured, vulnerable criminal organization. Stories of betrayal, survival, and the high stakes of loyalty permeated media and culture, highlighting the human costs behind the headlines. In the final reckoning, rats and wiretaps did more than just expose crimes. They dismantled an empire built on silence. The Commission's reign, once absolute and untouchable, was irrevocably altered. The era of shadows gave way to an age of exposure, where the voices behind the crimes were recorded, confessed, and prosecuted. This chapter of America's criminal history is a testament to the power of information and the limits of secrecy. It illustrates how the tools of modern law enforcement technology and human intelligence can penetrate even the most fortified criminal codes. The rise of informants and wiretaps signaled the beginning of the end for the Commission's untouchable empire, forever changing the landscape of organized crime in America. Chapter 17: Gotti vs. the Commission, the rise of the Teflon Don. In the shadows of the Commission's empire, a man emerged whose brash defiance and flamboyant persona would forever alter the Mafia's story. John Gotti, the self-styled Teflon Don, was a figure both feared and fascinated, embodying a new era of gangster bravado that clashed with the old-world codes the Commission sought to uphold. His rise, marked by audacity and calculated violence, challenged the delicate balance of power-setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to his spectacular downfall. Born in the Bronx and raised in the rough neighborhoods of Queens, Gotti's early life was steeped in poverty and hardship. From a young age, he understood the harsh realities of survival in New York's underworld. His entry into the Gambino family was not predestined by lineage or privilege, but earned through ruthless ambition and street smarts. He quickly developed a reputation as a fearless enforcer, unafraid to get his hands dirty. Unlike the shadowy, behind-the-scenes bosses who had traditionally led Mafia families, Gotti was a showman. He relished the spotlight, cultivating a public image that was both glamorous and untouchable. His penchant for expensive suits, flashy cars, and high-profile social appearances made him a media sensation. The press dubbed him the Dapper Don, a moniker that highlighted his sharp dress and unshakable confidence. This ostentation was more than vanity. It was a calculated challenge to the Commission's traditional, discreet style of leadership. Gotti's boldness sent ripples through the Mafia's ranks and the underworld at large. His disregard for the unwritten rules of secrecy and restraint irritated many established bosses who valued subtlety and caution. The turning point in Gotti's career came in 1985 when he orchestrated the assassination of Paul Castellano, the reigning Gambino boss and a staunch advocate of old-school Mafia decorum. The hit was audacious, a public execution outside a Manhattan steakhouse that shocked both law enforcement and organized crime alike. Castellano's murder was not sanctioned by the Commission, breaking one of the most sacred rules governing the Mafia's operations. No boss was to be killed without Commission approval. Gotti's decision to bypass the Commission's consent was a bold power play, signaling a fracture within the Mafia's leadership structure. It was a direct affront to the governing body's authority and challenged its ability to regulate disputes. By taking matters into his own hands, Gotti asserted his dominance, but also invited inevitable consequences. In the aftermath, Gotti consolidated power, becoming the undisputed boss of the Gambino family. His reign was marked by a mix of traditional racketeering and modern criminal enterprises: extortion, drug trafficking, loan sharking, and infiltration of legitimate businesses. Yet, unlike his predecessors, Gotti embraced the limelight, granting interviews and appearing openly in public, cultivating an image that blurred the lines between criminal and celebrity. Law enforcement agencies were both frustrated and fascinated by Gotti's persona. Despite numerous arrests and trials, he earned the nickname the Teflon Don because charges seemed to slide off him. Convictions were elusive, witnesses intimidated or disappearing, evidence insufficient or compromised. His courtroom victories became legendary, further cementing his reputation as a mobster who could defy the law and the Mafia's own internal rules with impunity. However, this veneer of invincibility masked a growing vulnerability. Gotti's flamboyance attracted intense scrutiny from federal prosecutors determined to bring him down. The FBI intensified surveillance efforts, deploying wiretaps and cultivating informants within his inner circle. The cracks in his empire began to show as paranoia and mistrust infiltrated his ranks. The most significant blow came from within the defection of his underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gravano's cooperation with the government was a betrayal that struck at the heart of Gotti's power. With insider testimony detailing murders, racketeering, and corruption, prosecutors finally secured convictions that had eluded them for years. Gotti's 1992 conviction on multiple charges, including murder and racketeering, marked the end of his reign. Sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, he became a symbol of both Mafia audacity and vulnerability. His downfall demonstrated the limits of charisma and bravado in the face of relentless legal pressure and internal betrayal. Beyond the courtroom, Gotti's legacy is complex. To some, he was a folk hero, a symbol of rebellion against authority, and a larger-than-life figure who defied the odds. To others, he was a violent criminal whose actions destabilized the Mafia and brought unwanted attention to its operations. His rise and fall encapsulate the tension between old traditions and new realities within organized crime. Gotti's story also reveals the changing nature of the Commission and the Mafia itself. His disregard for protocol and embrace of media attention challenged the organization's culture, forcing it to confront an evolving criminal landscape. The Commission's authority, once near absolute, was tested as internal discipline faltered and law enforcement's capabilities expanded. In the end, John Gotti's rise was as spectacular as his fall was inevitable. The Teflon Don's tale is a cautionary chronicle of ambition, defiance, and the costs of challenging an empire built on silence and order. It is a chapter etched in the history of America's underworld, a vivid testament to the complex interplay of power, personality, and peril that defined the Commission's reign. Chapter 18: Casino Crackdowns, the End of the Skim. For decades, Las Vegas stood as a shining testament to the Mafia's vision and ambition. The neon lights, the ringing slot machines, the allure of chance and fortune. This was the empire that the criminal underworld built with meticulous care. Behind the glamorous facade of casinos and luxury resorts, however, lay a hidden economy fueled by illegal skimming, corruption, and silent partnerships. The Mafia's grip on Sin City was a cornerstone of its national revenue, a lucrative venture that bolstered the Commission's coffers and extended its influence beyond the East Coast. The story of the Mafia in Las Vegas began in the mid-20th century, with legendary figures like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky playing pivotal roles in developing the city's first major casinos. Siegel's Flamingo Hotel was the prototype of modern gambling resorts, a symbol of the Mafia's reach into legitimate business. Lansky, the financial architect, envisioned a system where illicit profits could be funneled through legal enterprises, obscuring the origins of their wealth and laundering money with precision. For years, this arrangement worked seamlessly. Casinos operated under the watchful eyes of mob associates, who ensured that a portion of the profits, the skim, was siphoned off before it was officially reported. This money flowed quietly back to the Commission and its families, funding operations across the country. The skim was the Mafia's golden goose, generating millions without attracting undue attention. However, the very success of this scheme also planted the seeds of its demise. As Las Vegas grew, so did the scrutiny from federal authorities. The 1970s and 1980s saw an intensification of investigations into organized crime's involvement in the casino industry. The government's focus sharpened on uncovering the layers of secrecy that protected the skim and exposed the web of corruption entangled with state and local officials. Federal agents launched a series of raids and probes, targeting not only the casinos but also the broader network of accountants, lawyers, and frontmen who facilitated the Mafia's operations. These investigations revealed elaborate methods of money laundering, bribery, and intimidation designed to keep the skim flowing and the Mafia's involvement concealed. The regulatory landscape also began to change. The Nevada Gaming Control Board and other agencies implemented stricter oversight measures, including background checks for casino owners and executives, financial audits, and enhanced reporting requirements. These reforms aimed to sever the Mafia's influence by making it more difficult for known criminals or their associates to hold legitimate positions within the industry. The cumulative effect of law, enforcement pressure, and regulatory tightening was profound. Many mafia-controlled casinos faced closures, forced sales, or dramatic restructuring. The skim dried up as honest management replaced mob-connected operators. For the Commission, this represented a severe blow to its revenue streams and strategic reach. The Mafia's retreat from Las Vegas was not merely a financial setback, it was a symbolic defeat. The city had been a showcase of their power, a glittering monument to their ability to integrate criminal enterprise with legitimate business. Losing control over the casinos signaled the erosion of their empire and the limits of their influence in the face of modern law enforcement and governance. The decline of the skim also had ripple effects across the national criminal landscape. With reduced funds flowing from Las Vegas, families had to adjust their operations, focusing more heavily on other rackets, such as narcotics, loan sharking, and extortion. This shift altered the dynamics within the Commission, intensifying competition and, at times, internal conflicts. Moreover, the public exposure of the Mafia's casino involvement damaged its reputation. Drawing attention to the organization's pervasive corruption, media coverage and congressional hearings highlighted the intersection of crime, politics, and business, fueling calls for further reforms and vigilance. Despite these setbacks, the Commission did not vanish from Las Vegas entirely. Some families maintained residual interests, often through more covert means, leveraging connections to continue illicit activities on a smaller scale. However, the era of open, dominant control over the casino industry was effectively over. This chapter in the saga of America's underworld underscores the evolving nature of organized crime and the relentless efforts of law enforcement to dismantle its financial foundations. The crackdown on the skim marked a turning point, one where the Mafia's old methods of profit and power were challenged and, in many ways, overcome. The story of casino crackdowns is a testament to the complex dance between criminal ingenuity and governmental resolve. It reveals how the pursuit of justice and transparency can erode even the most entrenched and sophisticated criminal enterprises. For the Commission, it was a loss that reverberated through its ranks, a reminder that, in the shadowy world of organized crime, dominance is never guaranteed, and decline often begins where the lights shine the brightest. Chapter 19: The Lost Territories. Losing control of unions and streets. For decades, the Commission wielded its power not only through violence and intimidation, but also by seizing control of critical sectors of America's economy, particularly labor, unions, construction, and narcotics distribution. These lost territories became the backbone of its empire, generating immense wealth and influence. Yet, by the late 20th century, the foundations of this control began to crumble. Under the mounting weight of legal pressure and societal change, the Commission's once iron grip on these vital domains was slipping, and with it, much of its authority. Labor unions were among the Mafia's most prized possessions. The Teamsters, dockworkers, and construction unions were not simply sources of income, they were tools of power. Through union leadership positions, the Commission manipulated contracts, controlled labor markets, and extorted businesses, skimming union funds, demanding tribute, and orchestrating racketeering schemes. They effectively held entire industries hostage. This influence extended to crucial infrastructure projects, ports, and transportation networks, allowing the Mafia to embed itself deep within the fabric of American commerce. But this dominance was never uncontested. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, federal agencies and reform-minded politicians launched aggressive campaigns to expose and dismantle organized crimes, hold on unions. Investigations uncovered corruption scandals, fraudulent practices, and criminal intimidation. High-profile trials sought to remove mob-affiliated leaders and replace them with legitimate officials. The media coverage brought public outrage, galvanizing support for reform. One of the most significant legal tools was the use of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act RICO, which allowed prosecutors to target the entire network of criminal influence within unions. Cases against the Mafia's union bosses often resulted in convictions that sent shockwaves through the Commission's ranks. The loss of control over unions meant the erosion of a reliable revenue stream and a reduction in the Mafia's leverage over industries critical to its survival. Simultaneously, the construction industry, a sector rife with opportunities for extortion, bid rigging, and labor manipulation, began to slip away from Mafia control. Anti-corruption efforts, stricter regulations, and vigilant oversight reduced the Mafia's ability to impose its will on contractors and laborers. Federal oversight committees, whistleblower testimonies, and targeted prosecutions chipped away at the criminal influence that had once seemed untouchable. The decline was not purely legal or administrative. Economic shifts also played a role, as the construction landscape changed with new technologies, diversified workforces, and increasing competition from legitimate businesses. These changes undermined the Mafia's ability to monopolize local markets or intimidate competitors, forcing them to adapt or retreat. Perhaps most damaging of all was the waning of the Commission's control over drug trafficking networks, a lucrative but volatile territory. As law enforcement intensified drug interdiction efforts, deploying undercover agents, informants, and interagency collaboration, the Mafia's dominance in narcotics began to erode. New players, including independent drug cartels and street gangs, emerged as competitors, challenging the Commission's traditional monopolies. The violent turf wars that erupted in many cities underscored this decline. The Commission, once able to regulate drug distribution and settle disputes with ruthless efficiency, found itself outmatched by more agile and less hierarchical organizations. These struggles further exposed Mafia operations to law enforcement, leading to arrests and convictions that fractured families and networks. The cumulative effect of these losses was profound. The Commission's revenues declined, its influence diminished, and its ability to enforce order weakened. The organization faced a crisis of identity and purpose as it grappled with the realities of a changing criminal landscape and the relentless pursuit of justice. Within the family's frustration and uncertainty grew. The old guard lamented the loss of power and prestige, while younger members questioned the viability of traditional rackets. Internal disputes intensified as resources dwindled, and some factions sought alliances or new ventures outside the Mafia's historic domains. This erosion of control also had broader societal implications. The weakening of Mafia influence opened space for legitimate labor leaders to assert authority, for industries to become more transparent, and for communities to reclaim autonomy. It represented a slow but meaningful shift toward dismantling systemic corruption that had permeated economic life. Yet, the retreat from these territories was not total. Pockets of Mafia control persisted, often deeply embedded and resistant to eradication. The Commission and its families adapted, adopting more covert methods, diversifying their criminal portfolios, and seeking new ways to maintain relevance. The story of the lost territories is a tale of decline, resilience, and transformation. It illustrates the fragility of power built on fear and corruption when confronted with determined legal action and societal change. It is a reminder that empires, no matter how entrenched, are vulnerable to the forces of justice and progress. As the Commission's grip loosened on unions, construction, and drugs, the underworld was forced to evolve. The lost territories became symbols not only of what was lost, but also of the enduring struggle between criminal enterprise and the rule of law, struggle that continues to shape the American landscape to this day. Chapter 20. Witness Protection, Turning Made Men into Ghosts in the Shadowed Corridors of America's Criminal Underworld. Loyalty was once the most sacred currency. The Mafia's ironclad code of silence, Omertà, ensured that members, once inducted as made men, could live and operate with a measure of invulnerability. Speaking out was unthinkable, betrayal was punishable by death, and secrets were kept behind layers of fear and honor. Yet, as the tides of justice shifted in the latter half of the 20th century, a new force emerged that would irrevocably alter this landscape. The Witness Security Program, or WITSEC. Established in 1970 by the Department of Justice, WITSEC was designed to protect witnesses who risked their lives to testify against organized crime. At its core, it was a radical concept: turn criminals into witnesses, then erase their identities to save their lives. For the Commission, this innovation was nothing short of revolutionary and devastating. The ability of law enforcement to extract inside testimony, combined with the promise of safety and a new life, shattered the Mafia's once unbreakable grip on silence. The early years of WITSEC were tentative and experimental. Protecting witnesses was fraught with logistical and ethical challenges, relocating individuals across states, forging new identities, and severing ties with families and past lives. Yet, as the program matured, it became increasingly sophisticated and effective. The government offered not only physical protection, but also financial assistance, job training, and psychological counseling to those willing to become ghosts. Among the first high-profile defectors was Joseph Volati, whose Senate testimony had already laid bare the Mafia's secrets. But it was in the 1980s and 1990s, with the advent of the RICO statutes and intensified prosecutions, that WITSEC truly came into its own. Made men, under bosses, and even bosses, found themselves faced with impossible choices: remain loyal and face life imprisonment or death, or break the code and enter the program, becoming witnesses for the state. One of the most consequential turncoats was Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, as underboss of the Gambino family. Gravano was intimately familiar with the Commission's darkest deeds: murders, racketeering, extortion. His decision to cooperate with federal authorities was a watershed moment. His testimony not only sealed the fate of John Gotti but also sent shockwaves through the Mafia, demonstrating that even the most trusted and feared members would betray the organization when survival was at stake. WITSEC's impact extended beyond individual cases. The mere existence of a viable protection program sowed distrust and paranoia within the Mafia's ranks. The fear that any made man could turn informant eroded the bonds of loyalty that had long held families together. Trust, once the foundation of the criminal enterprise, became fragile. Suspicion grew, internal cohesion weakened, and the ability of the Commission to operate with impunity diminished. The program also transformed the legal landscape. Prosecutors gained access to first-hand accounts of crimes that were otherwise difficult to prove. Wiretaps and surveillance could only reveal so much. Witness testimony provided the narrative, the context, and the personal details that convictions required. Trials featuring WITSEC-protected witnesses became more frequent and more successful, yet the path of a protected witness was perilous and lonely. Entering WITSEC meant severing ties with one's past, family, friends, identity, all sacrificed in exchange for survival. Many struggled with the psychological toll of betrayal, isolation, and the constant threat of discovery by those who sought vengeance. For some, protection was incomplete or temporary, leading to tragic consequences. Nonetheless, the promise of WITSEC remained a powerful incentive. The ripple effects extended into the Mafia's culture. Recruitment slowed as the risks of betrayal became apparent. Younger generations of criminals were less inclined to join organizations where silence no longer guaranteed safety. The mystique of the commission, once shrouded in secrecy and fear, was increasingly undermined by stories of defections and disappearances. Moreover, WITSEC catalyzed broader reforms in law enforcement's approach to organized crime. Collaboration among agencies improved, with federal, state, and local forces sharing intelligence and resources. Witness protection became a cornerstone of the strategy to dismantle criminal empires from within, a model later adopted in combating other forms of organized and transnational crime. Despite its successes, WITSEC was not without controversy. Critics questioned the ethics of protecting criminals, the costs of maintaining new identities, and the potential for witness tampering or recidivism. Nonetheless, the program's undeniable effectiveness in weakening the commission and saving lives cemented its place in the annals of American justice. In the final analysis, WITSEC was a game-changer. It turned made men into ghosts from the streets, re-emerging as the government's most valuable assets. It exposed the fragility of a criminal empire built on silence and intimidation, proving that even the most feared organizations could be undone by the courage and cooperation of a few. The Witness Security Program redefined the battle between law enforcement and organized crime. It symbolized a shift from brute force to strategic intelligence, from silent fear to vocal testimony. The Commission's reign, once thought invulnerable, was broken not just by bullets or raids, but by words spoken behind closed doors, protected by new identities, and wielded in courtrooms across America. This chapter is a testament to the power of human will and institutional innovation. It reveals how protection, when paired with justice, can dismantle the darkest empires one witness at a time. The story of WITSEC is ultimately a story of redemption, survival, and the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of overwhelming danger. Chapter 21: Life Inside the Commission. Rules, Rituals, and Secrets. Behind the public veneer of criminal enterprises and violent turf wars, the Commission stood as an enigmatic institution, an unseen council where power was negotiated, decisions were forged, and the underworld's future was charted. This was no ordinary organization. It was a carefully constructed body governed by strict rules, ancient rituals, and guarded secrets. To understand how the Commission maintained control over America's underworld, one must step inside the shadowy boardroom where respect, fear, and tradition dictated every move. The Commission was created as a response to chaos, a means to prevent destructive wars that could draw unwanted law enforcement attention and destabilize profits. Its founders designed it as a governing council, composed of the most powerful mafia bosses from across the country, primarily the leaders of the 5 families in New York, supplemented by other influential bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, and beyond. This collective of men, bound by blood and oath, ruled with an iron fist, but always behind closed doors. The life inside the commission was steeped in formality and ritual. Meetings were rare but decisive, held in undisclosed locations, back rooms of restaurants, private clubs, or secluded homes. Attendance was by invitation only, and the seating arrangements reflected a hierarchy understood and respected by all. Each boss had a voice, but consensus was paramount. The principle was simple. Disputes among families had to be settled peacefully, or risk the devastation of violent conflict. Voting was a meticulous affair. Proposals from sanctioning hits to territorial disputes were debated with measured words. Each member weighed the consequences, not only for their own family, but for the Mafia as a whole. The goal was to preserve balance, to ensure that no single family amassed too much power at the expense of others. This delicate equilibrium was maintained through an unspoken understanding that personal ambition must bow to collective stability. But the Commission was not merely a legislative body. It was also the ultimate court of justice within the Mafia world. When vendettas arose, when blood had been spilled without approval, it was the Commission that adjudicated punishment. Orders of death were rarely issued lightly, for each assassination carried the risk of retaliation and escalation. Sanctioned hits were carefully considered, ensuring that any act of violence served a purpose beyond revenge, whether to eliminate a threat, enforce discipline, or reinforce authority. The rituals surrounding membership and decision-making were imbued with symbolism and secrecy. Bosses and capos swore oaths of loyalty, binding themselves to the Commission and the Code of Omertà. These oaths were not mere formalities. They represented a sacred pact, enforced by tradition and the ever-present threat of violent retribution for betrayal. Inside the Commission's inner sanctum, secrets were currency. Discussions on business ventures, alliances, and conflicts remained strictly confidential. Leakage of information was tantamount to treason. To this end, meetings were conducted with utmost discretion. No phones, no recordings, often with trusted guards posted outside. The layers of secrecy extended to the use of intermediaries, ensuring that even those summoned might not know the full extent of the meeting's agenda until they arrived. The human dynamics within the Commission were complex and fraught with tension. While these men were bound by shared purpose, rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Personal histories, grudges, and ambitions influenced interactions, yet decorum was maintained. Public displays of disrespect were rare, replaced instead by cold calculation and veiled threats. At times, new families or rising stars sought acceptance into the Commission's fold. These invitations were carefully considered, balancing the desire to expand influence with the risk of disrupting established order. Acceptance into the Commission was a crowning achievement, a recognition of power, influence, and reliability. It elevated a family from mere local operators to national players, with a voice in the Mafia's highest council. The Commission's power extended beyond dispute resolution. It orchestrated the division of territories, the apportionment of rackets, and the enforcement of laws that governed the underworld economy. From narcotics trafficking to labor union control, from gambling to loan sharking, the Commission regulated competition, preventing unnecessary conflict and ensuring that profits flowed smoothly. Yet, the Commission's authority was not absolute. It depended on consensus and mutual respect. Force was a last resort. When members defied rulings or pursued unauthorized violence, swift and often brutal consequences followed. Internal discipline was paramount, as any sign of weakness risked inviting external attacks or law enforcement. Infiltration This delicate balance between cooperation and competition was the hallmark of the Commission's longevity. It allowed the Mafia to evolve from fragmented gangs into a quasi-corporate structure, managing vast criminal enterprises with an efficiency that challenged legitimate institutions. The life inside the Commission was a testament to the power of organization, tradition, and ruthless pragmatism. Yet, behind the calculated exterior, these were men shaped by fear, ambition, and the harsh realities of their violent world. Meetings were not only about business, they were about survival. Each decision carried weighty consequences, and trust was a fragile commodity. Betrayal was always a lurking possibility, and many leaders walked a fine line between alliance and enmity. The rituals and secrets of the Commission were both shield and sword. They protected the organization from internal collapse and external threats, but they also fostered isolation and paranoia, as the need for secrecy created barriers, even among allies. This insularity sometimes hindered adaptability, making the Commission vulnerable to the new challenges of law enforcement tactics and internal dissent. Inside the Commission's clandestine meetings, history was made not just in terms of crimes and rackets, but in the shaping of an empire whose influence reached into every corner of American society. The stories of these gatherings are marked by intrigue, power struggles, and the quiet calculations of men who ruled a shadow kingdom. This chapter reveals the hidden heart of the Commission institution, where rules were absolute, rituals sacred, and secrets vital. It was here that the Mafia's fate was decided, where bloodlines met pragmatism, and where the underworld's greatest minds navigated the precarious balance between dominance and destruction. To peer inside the Commission is to glimpse a world where power was measured not only by violence but by restraint, where the sharp edge of a knife was wielded with care, and where silence spoke louder than words. It was the beating heart of America's underworld, world both feared and fascinating, forever etched into the country's criminal history. Chapter 22: Modern Mafia. What's left of the Commission? The Mafia that once ruled America's underworld with brutal efficiency, commanding vast empires through fear, loyalty, and unyielding control, is no longer the dominant force it once was. The 21st century ushered in profound changes, both external and internal, that fragmented the Commission's once formidable structure, forcing it into the shadows. Yet, beneath the quiet surface, the Mafia continues to breathe, adapting, evolving, and persisting in ways subtle but significant. The power that the Commission wielded throughout the mid-20th century was built on an intricate web of family alliances, carefully regulated rackets, and a code of silence that ensured cooperation. That era, marked by flamboyant bosses and sprawling criminal empires, has largely faded. Today's Mafia operates differently, less visible, less violent in public, and often more sophisticated in its approach. It has transformed from a feared street-level authority into a clandestine network, often overshadowed by newer criminal organizations, yet still influential in select sectors. The relentless pressure of law enforcement, particularly the groundbreaking legal strategies of the late 20th century, dismantled much of the Commission's overt power. The successful use of RICO statutes, coupled with the influx of informants protected by witness programs, struck deep wounds. Leaders were imprisoned, families fractured, and operations disrupted. The media's relentless spotlight and the public's growing intolerance of organized crime further isolated the Mafia from the communities it once dominated. Despite these setbacks, the Commission has never completely vanished. Its remnants remain embedded in traditional strongholds: New York, New Jersey, Chicago, and parts of New England, poeting through smaller, compartmentalized cells. This decentralization is both a response to law enforcement tactics and a strategic move to minimize exposure. Families now favor subtlety over spectacle, relying on influence behind closed doors rather than overt displays of power. Modern mafia families continue to engage in profitable criminal enterprises, loan sharking, illegal gambling, but they also diversify. White-collar crimes, such as money laundering, cyber fraud, and infiltration of legitimate businesses have become more prominent. This shift reflects both opportunity and necessity. The mafia understands that survival requires innovation and discretion in an era of digital surveillance and globalized crime. Labor unions, once a mafia stronghold, have largely slipped from their grasp due to reforms and federal oversight. Yet, some pockets of influence remain, particularly in industries resistant to modernization or heavily reliant on physical labor. The construction sector, waste management, and trucking are areas where the mafia quietly asserts control, often through front companies or by exploiting regulatory loopholes. The relationship with legitimate businesses is complex. The mafia increasingly invests in legal enterprises, using them to launder illicit profits while gaining social legitimacy and economic leverage. Restaurants, construction firms, and even real estate ventures serve as both covers and income streams. This blending of legal and illegal blurs lines, complicating law enforcement efforts and reflecting a strategic evolution. The mafia's social fabric has also changed. The sense of family loyalty and omertà remains, but younger generations are less inclined to follow the same path. The allure of the mafia lifestyle has diminished in the face of harsher penalties and alternative opportunities. Recruitment challenges force families to adapt, often relying on trusted associates outside traditional bloodlines. Technology has become both a tool and a threat. Criminals use encrypted communications, cryptocurrencies, and digital platforms to conduct business discreetly. However, law enforcement agencies have likewise embraced technology, deploying advanced surveillance, data analysis, and international cooperation to track and dismantle networks. This ongoing technological arms race shapes the modern mafia's operations and survival strategies. Violence, while less publicized, persists as a tool for enforcement and intimidation. However, families are more cautious, understanding that violent outbursts invite law enforcement scrutiny and public backlash. Instead, they favor economic coercion, legal manipulation, and strategic alliances. The mafia's power in the 21st century lies in its ability to influence, infiltrate, and intimidate without drawing undue attention. The Commission itself no longer functions as a unified, powerful governing body. Instead, what remains are fragmented groups that loosely coordinate, balancing cooperation with rivalry. The old order of decisive consensus-driven meetings has given way to informal understandings and pragmatic arrangements. The need for secrecy and survival has replaced the desire for dominance and expansion. International connections play a greater role in the modern landscape. The American mafia's influence overlaps with global organized crime Italian syndicates like the 'Ndrangheta, Russian mafias, and transnational drug cartels. These relationships facilitate trafficking, money laundering, and shared resources, but also introduce competition and complexity. The mafia must navigate a crowded criminal marketplace, where alliances are fluid and loyalties tentative. The social and economic conditions that once fostered mafia growth, poverty, discrimination, close-knit immigrant communities have shifted. The communities that gave rise to the mafia have changed demographically and economically, eroding traditional support networks. This transformation challenges the Mafia's recruitment and concealment, forcing adaptation to new social realities. Law, enforcement, community vigilance, and legislative reforms continue to erode the Mafia's foothold, yet the Mafia's resilience is rooted in its ability to evolve quietly, leveraging secrecy, relationships, and economic influence. It survives not as the empire it once was, but as a shadow network less visible, more fragmented, but still potent. This modern incarnation is harder to define and dismantle. Without towering figures or headline-grabbing violence, the Mafia operates in the gaps between legal and illegal, exploiting vulnerabilities in systems and society. Its story is no longer one of open war, but of quiet persistence. As America moves deeper into the 21st century, the question remains: what is the future of the Commission? Can it reinvent itself again, or is it a relic of a bygone era? The answer lies in its ability to continue adapting, hiding in plain sight, and wielding influence in subtle but impactful ways. This chapter reveals that the Mafia is no longer the monolithic empire it once was. It is a fragmented, quieter presence, an undercurrent beneath the surface of American life, shaped by history but ever evolving. The Commission, in its modern form, embodies both the legacy of power and the inevitability of change. It stands as a testament to the enduring, shadowy nature of organized crime, force diminished but not defeated, silent but still watching. Chapter 23: Hollywood and the Mob, the Legend Becomes Myth. From the smoky back rooms of New York to the glittering studios of Hollywood, the story of the Commission has transcended its origins, becoming woven into the very fabric of American culture. The brutal, shadowy world of the Mafia, once a terrifying reality for many, was transformed through film, television, and literature into a powerful mythos, one that shaped public imagination, perception, and understanding of organized crime. For generations, the allure of the Mafia was undeniable. It was a world of loyalty and betrayal, power and downfall, honor and ruthless violence. Hollywood recognized this drama early on, seizing upon the tension and spectacle to create stories that were part crime thriller, part tragic saga. From the first gangster films of the 1930s, like Little Caesar and Scarface, to the sweeping epics of the 1970s and beyond, the narrative of the Commission found fertile ground in the public's fascination with crime and morality. The depiction of Mafia life in cinema and television often blended fact with fiction, painting a picture that was at once captivating and distorted. The ruthless violence, the codes of silence, the complex family dynamics all became recurring themes. These stories introduced audiences to iconic characters: the calculating Don, the conflicted hitman, the loyal consigliere, the ambitious upstart. Though dramatized, these portrayals drew on real events and personalities, grounding myth in reality. The 1972 release of The Godfather was a pivotal moment in this cultural transformation. Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of Mario Puzo's novel elevated the Mafia narrative from pulp fiction to high art, weaving a tapestry of power, family, and tragedy that resonated far beyond crime genre fans. The film humanized its characters, presenting them not just as criminals, but as complex individuals caught in an inexorable fate. It popularized terms like the Commission and made man, embedding Mafia terminology into everyday language. Television also played a significant role. Series like The Sopranos in the late 1990s and early 2000s brought the Mafia into living rooms with unprecedented nuance. The show explored the psychological depth of its characters, the burdens of leadership, and the contradictions of a life ruled by violence and loyalty. It portrayed the Commission not merely as a shadowy cabal, but as a living, breathing organization grappling with internal strife and external pressures. Books and investigative journalism further demystified and documented the Commission's reach and operations. Works by journalists like Selwyn Robb, who chronicled the Mafia's rise and fall, offered detailed accounts grounded in exhaustive research. Memoirs and biographies by former insiders provided candid insights, though often blurred by personal agendas. These texts served as both exposes and historical records, bridging the gap between Hollywood glamorization and grim reality. Yet, the popular culture portrayal of the Commission has not been without consequences. The romanticized image of the Mafia, the dapper suits, the lavish parties, the loyalty to family sometimes obscured the brutal violence and exploitation that were its foundation. This glamorization has sparked debate about the ethics of turning crime into entertainment, and about the impact such portrayals have on public perception. The mythology surrounding the Commission also fed into stereotypes and myths about Italian identity, sometimes reinforcing negative cliches. Community leaders and scholars have grappled with these portrayals, seeking to balance acknowledgement of the Mafia's historical presence with the realities of law-abiding citizens' lives. Despite these complexities, the legend of the Commission has become a defining element of America's cultural narrative on crime and power. Its stories have inspired countless adaptations, parodies, and academic studies, reflecting society's enduring fascination with organized crime as a mirror for broader themes of loyalty, ambition, and justice. This chapter reveals how the intersection of media and organized crime transformed a secretive, violent institution into a mythic symbol. Hollywood's spotlight illuminated the Commission's shadowed halls, crafting a narrative that is part truth, part legend, and wholly influential. It shaped not only how the public views the Mafia, but also how the Mafia views itself, caught between reality and the legend it helped create. Through film, television, and literature, the Commission's story transcended its criminal origins to become a cultural icon, an enduring saga of power, family, and the dark allure of the American underworld. Chapter 24: Lessons from the Underworld, Power, Loyalty, and Greed. The story of the Commission is, at its core, a human story, one of ambition, trust, betrayal, and the ceaseless pursuit of power. Beneath the bloodshed and headlines, the rise and fall of America's most notorious organized crime syndicate offers profound lessons about the nature of power itself, the fragile bonds of loyalty, and the corrosive influence of greed. To understand the true legacy of the Commission, we must delve beyond the surface of crime and violence, and confront the philosophical and psychological forces that both held it together and ultimately tore it apart. Power in the underworld is not merely the ability to command or intimidate. It is a currency woven from fear, respect, and influencer, force that binds individuals into a complex web of obligation and control. The leaders of the Commission understood that raw violence was unsustainable. Power required structure, rules, and negotiation. The creation of the Commission itself was a recognition that unchecked ambition and vendetta would only lead to mutual destruction. Power was to be wielded with strategy, a calculated balance of cooperation and dominance. Loyalty was the foundation upon which this power rested. The Mafia's code of Omertà, the vow of silence, was not simply a rule but a sacred oath binding members to one another. Loyalty meant more than obedience. It was a bond of blood and shared history, a code that demanded sacrifice and silence, even at the cost of personal freedom or life. This loyalty was both a source of strength and vulnerability. It fostered trust and unity in a dangerous world, but could also breed paranoia and betrayal when broken. The paradox of loyalty in the Commission's story lies in its fragility. Time and again, loyalty was tested by the allure of self-preservation or ambition. Informants like Joe Valachi and Sammy Gravano exposed the deepest secrets for a chance at freedom, shaking the Mafia's foundations. These betrayals revealed that loyalty, while powerful, is never absolute. It is a delicate balance between fear and respect, held together by tradition but vulnerable to the pressures of survival. Greed, perhaps, was the most destructive force within the Commission. The desire for wealth and control fueled the expansion of criminal enterprises but also sowed seeds of discord. As families competed for territories and profits, internal rivalries ignited wars and power struggles. The lust for greater riches often eclipsed the collective good, eroding the fragile equilibrium the Commission sought to maintain. Yet, greed was not simply avarice, it was intertwined with identity and status. For many within the Commission, the accumulation of wealth was a symbol of success, respect, and legitimacy. It was proof of survival in a brutal world. This quest for more, however, became a double-edged sword, blinding leaders to risks and fostering mistrust. The psychological complexity of life inside the Commission reveals a world where power and loyalty coexisted uneasily with fear and ambition. Leaders navigated a precarious path, balancing respect for tradition with ruthless pragmatism. The weight of leadership was heavy. Decisions could mean life or death, loyalty or betrayal. This constant tension shaped personalities hardened by violence, but haunted by the consequences. The Mafia's rituals and codes were attempts to impose order on chaos, a way to humanize an inherently brutal enterprise. Initiations, oaths, and secret meetings provided a sense of belonging and purpose, even as the reality was often harsh and unforgiving. These structures created identity, a sense of family, and an illusion of control over an unpredictable world. But these very bonds, steeped in tradition and secrecy, also contributed to the Commission's downfall. The insularity bred complacency and resistance to change. When external pressures mounted, law enforcement advancements, societal shifts, internal betrayals, the rigid adherence to old codes became a liability. The inability to adapt swiftly and transparently fractured the organization from within. The story of the Commission is a cautionary tale about the limits of power built on fear and silence. It reveals how even the most tightly knit alliances can unravel under the weight of human frailty, ambition, greed, and mistrust. The Mafia's rise and fall underscore the paradox of power. It demands unity but breeds division. It requires secrecy but is undone by exposure. This chapter offers a reflection on the enduring lessons from the underworld. It challenges us to see organized crime not merely as a criminal phenomenon but as a mirror reflecting universal human struggles, the thirst for power, the need for belonging, and the perilous allure of greed. The Commission's legacy is thus not only a history of crime but a profound study of human nature and the fragile architecture of trust and authority. As the Commission's empire crumbled, the lessons remained. Power without accountability becomes tyranny. Loyalty without reason invites betrayal. And greed unchecked destroys even the strongest bonds. These truths resonate far beyond the criminal world. echoing in the corridors of legitimate power and human relationships alike. In the final reckoning, the Commission stands as a testament to the complexity of power and the human conditioner, story as much about the men who wielded it as about the society that both feared and enabled them. It is a legacy marked by darkness, but illuminated by insight and narrative that continues to captivate and caution long after the guns have fallen silent. Chapter 25. The Commission's Last Breath, End of an Era. The story of the Commission is the story of power, a power that once operated in the shadows, yet commanded control over vast territories, thousands of lives, and countless criminal enterprises across America. For decades, this invisible boardroom, composed of the nation's most ruthless and calculating crime bosses, held the reins of the underworld. It was a realm where violence was brokered by negotiation, rivalries tempered by counsel, and orders carried out with chilling precision. But all empires, no matter how seemingly invincible, eventually confront the forces of change. The Commission's last breath marked not just the decline of a criminal institution, but the end of an era that defined American organized crime for much of the 20th century. The seeds of the Commission's demise were planted within its own walls. The very structure that was designed to prevent the chaotic bloodshed of earlier gang wars became a crucible of tension and fragility. As decades passed, the unspoken rules that kept families in uneasy balance began to fracture under the weight of ambition, betrayal, and evolving social realities. The once ironclad code of Omertà, the sacred vow of silence, was broken repeatedly, unraveling the secrecy that had shielded the Commission from law enforcement's grasp. The rise of modern policing techniques, sophisticated surveillance, and legal innovations such as the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act RICO hit the Commission hard. The coordinated federal campaigns of the 1980s and 1990s targeted its leadership with unprecedented force, dismantling traditional hierarchies and exposing the inner workings of an organization that had long thrived on invisibility. High prosecutions shattered the myth of invulnerability that surrounded the bosses and made public the extent of corruption and violence that underpinned the Mafia's reign. At the same time, the Mafia's social and economic base was eroding. The immigrant neighborhoods that had once served as recruitment grounds and sanctuaries changed irrevocably, integrating into broader society and abandoning the old codes. Younger generations of Italian-Americans sought different paths, less attracted to the risk and brutality of Mafia life. The Commission found itself facing a recruitment crisis, struggling to maintain relevance in a world that no longer mirrored the one that gave birth to it. Internal divisions grew more pronounced. Factions and families drifted apart, sometimes engaging in violent feuds, other times simply withdrawing into isolation. The Commission's authority, once undisputed, was challenged not only by law enforcement but also by emerging criminal groups, including motorcycle gangs, drug cartels, and international syndicates. The once cohesive alliance became fragmented, reduced to informal understandings rather than enforceable mandates. Despite these pressures, the Commission's legacy is undeniable. It shaped the landscape of organized crime with a blueprint of governance and control that influenced not just the Mafia, but countless criminal enterprises worldwide. Its methods, the boardroom diplomacy, the strict codes, the system of checks and balances, were as much a part of its power as the violence that enforced them. As the final chapters of the Commission's story unfolded, it became clear that the era of the crime family had passed. The era of street bosses and secret councils gave way to more diffuse networks, less centralized but no less dangerous. The Mafia of the 21st century is quieter, more cautious, and more entwined with legitimate business than ever before. The faces of power changed. The names faded from headlines. The boardroom meetings, once the stuff of legend, became memories whispered among survivors and historians. Yet, in reflecting on the Commission's end, it is impossible not to acknowledge the profound impact it had on America's underworld and beyond. It left an indelible mark on law enforcement, prompting innovations in criminal justice and surveillance. It influenced culture and media, spawning stories and myths that continue to captivate. It forced society to confront the blurred lines between legality and criminality, power and corruption. This chapter, and this documentary, closes with a meditation on the fragile nature of power, how an empire built on silence and violence could command respect and fear for decades, and yet dissolve under the relentless pressures of time, law, and changing society. The Commission's last breath was a quiet one, marked not by explosions or shootings, but by the slow erosion of influence and the inevitable fading of an era that once ruled America's underworld with an iron fist hidden behind a velvet glove. In the end, the Commission remains a testament to the complexities of organized crime, a reminder that beneath the glamour and terror lies a human story of ambition, loyalty, greed, and ultimately, mortality. It is a story that continues to resonate, warning us of the costs of power unchecked and the inevitability of change, no matter how deeply entrenched the shadows may seem.